Hi, everybody. I am so late and I'm so sorry. I just need to log on to TalkShoe before everybody leaves. Testing your network, internet.
You are joining the online studio. You are unmuted and can speak with the host.
Okay, I'm so sorry I'm late. Let's see. Share screen, start recording. Okay. Live stream, record video. All right, so I am so sorry that I am late. I'm just signing into TalkShoe. Okay. Let's see. I think I had everything going. Yeah, it's crazy. Um, Again, I apologize for being late. So let me just get started because this is going to be long. And let me just hop right into it. I think I'm on TalkShoe and I'm on YouTube. Thank you for waiting for me, whoever waited for me. Let's see. So first a disclaimer, which I forgot I have to read the disclaimer. Sorry, I'm just looking for my disclaimer. Let's see. Okay, disclaimer. The opinions expressed on this forum is not representative of PLN's official stance. RX's opinion is based on the information available at the time and not PLN's official stance. Not everyone who calls in is a TI. The gang stalkers have a tendency to pretend to be TIs and interfere with activities related to TIs. PLN and RX can't guarantee that TI hour participants, including guests, are real TIs, or if what is being
Recording started.
or if what is being said by anyone is true. This isn't to invalidate anyone, but to take into consideration that gang stalkers sometimes pretend to be TIs. Okay, with that said, let's get started. Sorry, I am all over the place today. Okay, here. All right, so let's see. So this, so as you can see, we're gonna listen to a book today, and this is actually because someone, while I was doing Should TIs Date, someone wrote that they were more interested in electronic harassment. So I said, let me do something to kind of start the ball rolling on electronic harassment. So let me read this disclaimer. Well, let me start. Okay. So last time I narrated the movie Gaslight. It is a movie that has been referenced by a lot of TIs, but I wasn't sure how many people actually watched the movie. It was important to watch it because it helps explain the term and shows how one type of psychopath, and it shows one type of psychopath. Anyone who watches that video can reference the movie like a pro now, except there is a more popular version of the video, and that may be the one everyone references. Either way, after watching the version I narrated, you can see more details in the more popular version and appear well versed in how the movie shaped the term. I turned the 3 videos into an intro to psychopaths crash course because when I reviewed the Should TIs Date video before reviewing the Listen to Gaslight videos, it actually made more sense. The Should TIs Date video foreshadowed the Gaslight movie, and it was cool to actually see a psychopath in action instead of just listening to the victims and mental health professionals' accounts. I think that after taking that free crash course, a person who is new to all this will have a better understanding of the psychopath. To get the most out of the crash course, you have to just pick a day that you can sit down and watch or listen to the video for 6 hours. I suggest taking about 10 to 15-minute breaks in between, but you want to make sure that you pay attention. And sometimes if you're sitting here and you're just watching the videos, you might like lose sight. So if you find yourself kind of like dozing, just like take a 10-minute break and then come back and then watch, continue the crash course, or 10 or 15 minutes, however long you need. And if you have a short attention span, then plan it out in a way that works for you. You really could listen to the videos instead of watching, because really you're just watching me, so you aren't really missing anything by just listening, right? I've tried doing other things. I have tried doing other things while listening to a video, and I found that I heard what was being said, but I wasn't paying attention, and I missed a few things. So I would have to like go back and rewind the video and everything. So I found that listening while not doing anything else, but maybe like jotting down a few notes was better. PLN, so maybe you want to take that into consideration. PLN also has a Psychopaths 101 course, which is around $200, and the course is once a week for a month. It follows a similar format as the crash course, except instead of the facilitator narrating, you will actually watch the movie together. And there are also discussion groups and other things to help you learn how to spot a narcissist, psychopath, or identify narcissistic, psychopathic abuse better. I am the facilitator right now, but that may change in the future so that you are not surprised. All right, let me make sure no one's saying anything. Okay, so I'm going to continue. All right. Um, so I could also do a follow-up to the Intro to Psychopaths crash course with a course that is based on the videos in the crash course, but you don't have to watch the whole movie again. So I will facilitate it through a live stream conference or some sort I will facilitate it through a live stream conference of some sort, and there will be discussions and some additional material since after taking the free course, everyone should be on the same page and will know what everyone else is talking about when they reference the course material. That, of course, would cost money. And if you're interested, let me know by sending an email. The course requires a group discussion. So either you can get a group together so you can have your own private group session, and I would charge a group rate. Or if you are just one person, I will wait until I have enough participants to form a group for discussion purposes, and then I will start the course. The contact email will be listed in the YouTube video's description box for those who are interested after I finish this video. Okay. So, with all that said, a lot of people want to talk about electronic harassment. You know, it's one of the touchy subjects in this whole gang stalking thing. It's a touchy subject because there is no publicly accepted hard proof, even though TIs have already put out so much information. And even though I have let the public hear some of the voices used in electronic harassment in the covert combo videos and the go and subliminal videos, some people still don't believe that electronic harassment is real. They don't believe that, what I showed them is real. So I decided I got to delve into this or give at least a basic intro. So now, TIs, please understand that I am making these TI hour shows with both TIs and the general public in mind. So there's a lot of basic information. The show is really meant to be a discussion where TIs do most of the talking, but since there isn't that many viewers or people chatting or calling in, I'm improvising a bit. It's still a show for TIs to discuss what is happening to them, but until there is more participation, I will use it as a way to help TIs better understand what is happening to them and to help the general public see where the things TIs believe are coming from. Because right now, they just don't know, or at least they have like a slight idea. So, Gaslight is a movie that is referenced a lot, and one book that is referenced a lot, but probably not enough, is Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psychocivilized Society by Jose Delgado. All right. So that the general public or the audience, as I call them from time to time, will know that so that the general public or audience will know the basics of TI's electronic harassment and how it's rooted in real science, and for TIs to reference this book like a pro, the next few TI hours will be listening to this book with commentaries. There will be a weekly TI hour, there will be weekly free TI hours for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, including this one. So next week I'm going to have a TI hour, and the week after that I'm going to have a TI hour so we can finish this book. This 3-week book club, okay, you're part of a book club now if you're watching. It's temporary. Will also show some features of PLN's Patreon. Will also show some features of PLN's Patreon book club. I'm in charge of the Patreon, and as soon as I get a certain number of patrons, I will start a book club, and it will be similar to the next few free TI hours. Similar, not exactly the same. So I wanted to start. Let me just make sure no one's saying anything, so I'm not ignoring you. Okay, awesome. Well, not awesome, but. All right. Awesome that I didn't miss anything. All right. So let's talk a little bit about my research. Okay. I broke this research up into two parts. A hypothesis can apply to an experiment or a research. I'm applying the following hypothesis to the research. So the hypothesis for the first part of my research will be something like, is the stalking that TIs claim is happening possible? I have enough information to basically prove that the stalking by proxy part is possible and actual. The second hypothesis for the other part of the research will be something like, is electronic harassment real, or is it a PTSD side effect of being a TI? TIs. That is not a slap in the face. The way science works is that you have to prove your theory, and you have to do so in a way that other scientists or researchers can get the same results as you doing the same things. The reason why I stated the hypothesis that way is because I can pretty much prove the stalking is possible, but the electronic harassment part is harder to prove at this point in time. Even if the general public believes that the stalking part even if the general public believes in the stalking part, electronic harassment is still an issue. If I prove that the stalking part of gang stalking is real, I know that another researcher or mental health professional may say that electronic harassment may be the stress effects of being stalked by the psychopathic network. That makes sense, doesn't it? However, since I have gone subliminal, I know that electronic harassment is probably more than that. So I wanted the hypothesis to reflect a logical inference and kind of work around that, since it will probably come up. So before I started reading the book, I came across an interesting word, electroceuticals. I looked it up, and it wasn't a term that TIs made up. It is widely accepted in the general public. And here is a definition from Science Direct. So, electroceuticals. Electroceuticals are a new category of therapeutic agents which act by targeting the neural circuits of organs. The therapy involves mapping the neural circuitry and delivering neural impulses to these specific targets. The impulse is administered via an implantable device. So, definition, electroceuticals is a recently coined term for an old therapeutic modality that broadly encompasses all bioelectronic medicine. It includes any type of electric stimulation to affect and modify functions of the body. Neural implants such as cochlear implants, retinal implants, or spinal cord stimulators for pain relief, but also cardiac pacemakers and implantable defibrillators. Recently, the field has expanded to include deep brain stimulation and the electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve, also called bioelectronics. The idea, excuse me, also called bioelectronics. The idea is that I kind of confused myself, but I'm not going to read that. Okay, actually, I will. It includes any type of electrical stimulation to affect and modify functions of the body, neural implants such as cochlear implants, retinal implants, or spinal cord stimulators for pain relief, but also cardiac pacemakers and implantable defibrillators. Recently, the field has expanded to include deep brain stimulation and the electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve. Also, okay, also called bioelectronics, the idea is that tiny electronic implants will be able to treat a vast range of chronic diseases such as diabetes, asthma, chronic obstructive airways, arthritis, hypertension, and other heart ailments and gastrointestinal diseases. And then in another article in Science Direct called Electroceuticals in Medicine, The Brave New Future. Um, I think that was what I read. Oh no, I was gonna post. Let me post that for you so that you could look that up. And that's where I just got that from. Hold on. All right. All right. Featured article. I'm just putting the link to what I just read so that you could check it out yourself and read the article. It is quite interesting. All right. Featured article, electroceuticals. Okay. So that is what I just read. And let's see. I'm gonna post it. If you're listening to me on TalkShoe, I'm gonna post that up in a minute. I just want to get this started. Okay, and this. Okay, so that was a great intro to the book because electronic harassment often leads to electronic illness. The general public talks about electroceuticals to heal, and TIs talk about a similar technology that is used to hurt or cause illness. Maybe the TIs are warning about what can happen if electroceuticals get into the wrong hands. I will post a link to a very basic article about electronic illness that PLN wrote so that you know what I'm talking about when I say electronic harassment. It's not like it's just that's a coin I just termed it. It's not like well known or anything because electronic harassment is not well known. During next week's book reading, you will see what is okay. During next week, not this week, because I broke this book up into like several parts so that we could get through it. But during next week's book reading, you will see that what is supposedly the new electroceutical has been attempted before. So it's not a new science, but again, it did say that in the little brief that I read you. So let me just post this in talk shoe before I forget, because I probably will forget. Article. Okay. All right. So we're reading this book. So you can either buy and read the book with Scribd, SCRBD, Barnes and Nobles or Amazon if you want. Right now, it's very expensive. It's like $100, $80 for this book. It used to be around $10 on Kindle, but the ebook was pulled. That's what I got. I've had this book for 2 years, and I started reading it and then I stopped and I was like, okay, I got to read this book. I got to read this book. And so one of the reasons why I'm reading with you is because it's going to force me to finally read the book. So it's 2 years later. I'm finally getting through, getting to reading the book. Okay, the Scribd one, SCRBD, is available, but I'm not sure if there's a free for a limited time offer or if you have to pay to read it. I'll let you know which chapters are being read during each show. There's only 3 shows on this topic, on this intro. You can read it ahead of time, so you can comment or ask questions if you want. Even if you don't understand what you are reading, try to read it anyway because we're going to discuss it so that you can get a better understanding of the book. Remember that you don't have to agree with what I say, and this is to help you get a better understanding of some of the things that helped electronic harassment come about. Either way, make some tea or coffee and get a snack, nothing crunchy because you want to hear everything. Sit back and listen to the book and my commentary. If you want, you can chat in. I'm not narrating, so I can respond sometimes. And also be aware that when you start typing or taking notes, you might miss some of the information being read. You can take brief notes so you don't miss anything and ask questions during the commentary. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. This is TI Hour, a time for TIs to talk or chat in. And I have my notes, so I probably won't lose my place anyway. Sorry, I got hair in my face. Hair in my eye. All right. So to the book, finally. I'm sorry I gave a long intro, but it's all necessary. It's all necessary. Okay. So physical control of the mind towards a psychocivilized society was probably written for people who had some background in the book's field of study. This means that the general public may have some difficulty fully understanding some of the ideas. This also means that there are no stupid questions. And since this isn't my field of study, I won't be able to answer all your questions. However, there could be discussions that could help whoever asks the questions that maybe I can't answer to seek more information and get closer to an answer. So during the commentaries, I'm giving basic explanations, not as thorough as an expert in the book's field of study would offer. It's just enough to give a basic understanding, and you can look further into the topic if you want. Okay. This may all seem boring to you, but TIs, I'm giving you tools to be more knowledgeable about what is happening. Um, so, so just bear with me. I know you're like, oh, she talks about these boring things and stuff, but you really need to know this. I think that TIs need to be well versed in this also, because it's going to help you while you're out there advocating, while you're out there protesting, while you're out there having interviews and trying to explain your cause. what I'm telling you and what I'm trying to help you understand is going to help you prove, not if not prove, at least talk about better and be more convincing when you talk. And here is a PDF. It's free. I should have wrote something, right? I'll figure out what to write later. But that's, if you want to, you can go to that now. I'm gonna reference it. It is a free version of the book. I think was made by PACS, PACTS, which I think is like a TI organization of some sort. I don't remember what it stands for or anything, but yeah, it's from them and PACS International. I think I should have looked more into it. But that's the PDF. It's free. You could access it now so that you could read along. However, this does not have chapter 6, but it has chapter 7 and so forth. There are also missing sentences or paragraphs in various parts of the PDF I'm giving you, but or linking of the link I just gave you, but it can still work for this purpose. So I'm warning you now, the first half hour or more of this is going to be boring. Okay. But bear with me. Reading these parts are important and it definitely will get better. So what I did was just I skipped 5 chapters because you're gonna just fall asleep if if I if I, if we had to read that. So because we're at the point that I think most people are right now, it would just be boring to them and they wouldn't understand it. But I think like after you go through the whole book, you could go back to the 5 chapters and the first 5 chapters and it'll make more sense to you. So with that said, my long intro, let's get started. Here's the book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play. Why didn't I think I wrote that I was going to do divide it up into 15-minute sections, and then I thought I wrote. Okay, I'm gonna divide it up into 15-minute sections, just like I did with the movie, and then I'm gonna comment every 15 minutes. So let me get started. It might run over 15 minutes, but I mean over 3 hours, but I'm trying not to let it. It probably will though, but whatever. So here it is. Here, let's get started with the book.
Chapter 6: The Mindless Newborn Brain. Psychoanalytical interpretations of fetal life are not in accord with the concept of a mindless newborn brain, which I propose, and some authors present a different viewpoint in approximately the following terms. In the intimate cloister of the mother, a growing being lives a peaceful, sheltered existence. In this uterine paradise, without fears or anxieties, the embryo must have a mother libido, and it experiences pleasure and pain, as demonstrated by impulsive movements and by the sucking responses, which are expressions of pleasurable sexual sensations related to mental states of the fetus. Thinking and willing are perhaps present to only a limited extent, but feeling exists in the embryo with hypertrophic sensitivity. One day, something terrible happens. The carefree parasitic existence is terminated, and there is a brutal separation of the child from the libido object, the mother causing a psychic trauma, the primal or original anxiety state. Later on, the child will try to return symbolically to its mother's womb, and subconsciously, he may remember forever the states of embryonic life and the anxiety of birth. The child's neurosis is a natural result of his traumatic arrival. He is usually able to overcome it, although occasionally it persists during adult life. Sager reported that when he could not relate to some patients' neuroses to their embryonic periods, he induced them to recall what happened to their original spermatozoa and ova, or even to remember possible parental attitudes, which could have produced a trauma in the delicate germinal cells before conception. Sager maintained that these cells have a psychic life of their own with the capacity to learn and to remember. It is difficult to accept the introspective statement of a neurotic patient who claims to possess a spermatozoic memory, since experimental studies show that the reaction of newborn babies are so elemental that they can hardly be considered signs of a functioning mind. It is doubtful, if not indeed illogical, to attribute a higher degree of mental activity to a fetus at an even earlier stage of embryonic development. The possible existence of psychic functions in the newborn has been repeatedly debated. Some authorities accept the presence in the infants of three primary emotions: fear, rage, and love, and believe that all other emotions result from the conditioning of these innate patterns by environmental stimuli. The theory of differential emotional patterns in the neonate suffered a serious blow when it was demonstrated that competent observers of infant behavior could not agree on their interpretations of emotional patterns recorded by moving pictures unless they knew the type of stimuli applied. The term emotion should not be ascribed to infant behavior because it lacks differentiated responses, and the existence of a mind in the neonate is really a matter of definition. The mind is characterized by many heterogeneous functions, some of which exist at birth, if only in elemental form. Symbolic processes, as determined by correlation procedures, do not exist in the neonate, but temporary learning of simple conditioned responses has been demonstrated. Four conditions have been proposed as prerequisite to acceptance of the existence of intelligent behavior in any organism. One, a functional cerebral cortex. Two, functional distance receptors. Three, an upright posture. And four, the achievement of substitutive or symbolic behavior. According to these criteria, the neonate does not qualify for intelligent behavior, and its activities should not be considered signs of mental life. Careful studies of infants demonstrate that their eyes will follow small moving spots of light as early as 2 weeks after birth. Auditory sensitivity is controversial, and pitch discrimination and differential responses related to the patterning of sound seem to be absent. Auditory conditioning has been unsuccessful until the second month of life. The existence of olfactory perception and even gustatory discrimination is rather doubtful, but sour and bitter solutions influence sucking and may evoke facial responses. The newborn baby's ability to orient toward the nipple of the mother's breast is the most important response in his repertoire. Human beings are born with such cerebral immaturity that their very survival depends completely on exterior help, and their behavior is similar to that of a purely spinal being, or at most, of a brainstem or midbrain preparation. Most neurologists agree that the neonate is a non-cortical being. After birth, there is a transitional period during which the cerebral cortex starts to function, and then its activities progressively increase until a reciprocal functional correlation is established with the rest of the brain. It had been generally assumed that mammals were born with most of their cerebral neurons present, and that further development was limited to some synaptic elaboration of the already existing neuronal network. Recent studies performed with radio tracers have revealed, however, that at least in the hippocampus, olfactory bulb, and cerebellar cortex of mammals, as many as 80 to 90% of the neurons form only after the animal is born. Experience provided by sensory inputs from the environment influences the number as well as the structural connections of these postnatal cells. Moreover, as Cajal suggested long ago, the microneurons of the cerebellum, which serve as association elements, develop after birth under the influence of the infant's behavioral activities. Therefore, it can be said that the environment is absorbed as a structural part of the neurons in the developing brain. The conclusive proof that performance of neonate behavior does not require a mind or even a brain derives from the study of several anencephalic beings in whom reflexes and behavioral manifestations were similar to those of normal babies. Some of these infants, born without cerebrums, lived for only 1 or 2 days, but others survived for 2 or more months and could be studied in great detail. One of the most famous cases was the mesencephalic child, which had only midbrain, pons, and cerebellum, lacked pallidum, striatum, and cortex, and had only a few traces of diencephalon. This abnormal being had reduced motor performance, but the startle reaction and grasping reflexes were well preserved. He was able to assume a sitting position spontaneously when both lower legs were pressed, and occasionally he yawned and stretched his arms. He had periodic alternating states of quietude and activity, resembling sleep and wakefulness. His feeding behavior was nearly normal, and he could follow a moving finger with his eyes and head. He cried and was observed to suck his thumb spontaneously. The main difference between an anencephalic and normal infants is that in a child lacking cortex and other parts of the brain, responses and activities remain stationary, while a normal infant quickly develops new behavior patterns. Having seen that mental functions in man cannot be demonstrated at birth, we may ask which elements are essential for their appearance and development, and we may wonder why the newborn baby is mindless. Why isn't the brain detectable at birth? Because it is hidden or dormant inside the neurons, or because it doesn't yet exist within the brain? These questions correspond to the following differing hypotheses. 1. Human beings, in comparison with other animals, are less developed at birth, being anatomically and physiologically immature and requiring a postnatal growing period in order to reach their expected potential. In this case, the essential elements for the appearance of the mind, which are determined genetically, are already present at birth and only need time to develop and demonstrate their existence. The mind is there even if it cannot be detected. 2. A different point of view is that the brain is not sufficient to produce mental phenomena. The brain is only a reactive organizer of transactions of elements located in the environment and transmitted to the individual by sensory receptors and pathways. According to this hypothesis, the reception of extracerebral factors, the experience of living, is essential for the appearance of the mind and is the basic element upon which mental development is conditional. While instinctive behavior may appear even in the absence of experience, mental activity cannot. Confronting these two theories, we face again the basic questions of the origin of mind and whether mental functions could appear simply by process of anatomical maturation. To find answers, we must be acquainted with some experimental facts. It is known that cerebral maturity in animals is of only relative value for behavioral performance. With merely 20% of their neurons myelinated, 24-day-old white rats are trainable and can learn associations as well as adult rats. Early visual experience is important for the normal development of higher animals, but is not essential in lower species. Rats raised in darkness since birth have no visual defects when exposed to light for the first time. Birds also manage quite well, although ringdoves, which have worn translucent goggles to block visual patterns but not light, show a moderate decrease in the speed of learning pattern discrimination when their goggles are removed. Studies of early visual deprivation in higher animals tell a different story. In one investigation, 4 baby chimpanzees were separated from their mothers shortly after birth, and each was kept in a darkened room and given only 90 minutes daily exposure to a limited, diffuse light. 7 months later, testing of the animals showed normal pupillary reactions to light, but lack of eye blink, visual fixation, and pursuit of moving objects. Unlike the control animals, these chimpanzees did not appear upset if they were being fed by strangers, nor did they recognize their feeding bottles. In visual discrimination and conditioning tests, the animals reared in darkness required more than twice as many trials as did the control animals, and committed over twice as many errors. After living for 3.5 months outside the darkened room, only one of the chimpanzees began to converge his eyes on an object brought into contact with his lips. In this animal, discrimination of vertical versus horizontal strips was soon acquired, while recognition of faces took much longer. Biochemical studies have confirmed the importance of sensory stimulation for normal cerebral development. In animals deprived of sight or hearing, the corresponding neurons of the system do not develop biochemically. Their structure appears normal, but inside they are like empty bags, impoverished in both RNA and proteins. The importance of adequate sensory stimulation for postnatal neurochemical maturation has also been demonstrated by Bratgard in his studies of retinal ganglion cells. During the early postnatal period, animals receiving normal light stimulation had a 100% increase in cellular mass, as measured by the total amount of organic substance, while animals deprived of light did not show this change. Moderate sensory stimulation of the vestibular system caused by rotation of the body resulted in a 40% increase in the RNA concentration in the vestibular ganglion cells, and also an increase in amino acid absorption. During the last 15 years, researchers at Berkeley have performed chemical behavioral studies demonstrating that individual experience can lead to measurable alterations of the chemistry and anatomy of the brain. They started with the search for relations between naturally occurring differences in brain chemistry and differences in learning ability, and then analyzed the effects of experience on brain chemistry. It was known that enriched early sensory inputs benefit subsequent learning, and the investigations were oriented to find the biochemical link between early environment and later effects. Experimental studies in rats proved that exposing littermates to either enriched or impoverished environments for 8 days produced in the enriched group significant increases in 1. The weight of the cerebral cortex, 2. Total activity of the enzyme acetylcholine esterase throughout the brain, 3. Total activity of cholinesterase in the cortex, 4. Thickness and vascularization of the cerebral cortex. Because acetylcholine is a possible transmitter substance, changes in the enzymes which regulate its appearance and breakdown have important functional significance.
Okay, so that was the first 15 minutes. You got through it. Okay. Well, a lot of you are probably like, oh my God, what is going on? What is this person saying? You don't have to understand all of it. This chapter is kind of dense, you know. And unless you're into that stuff, you're probably like, huh? So don't worry about it. All right. But I think maybe like once we get through the book, you can go back and understand it just a little bit more. And then if you want to do watch some basic anatomy videos and stuff, you can probably get it. So anyway, so I'm doing this because when TIs talk about, and I don't know if I read this or not, but I'm doing this because when TIs talk about some topics such as MK Ultra, electronic harassment, Project Monarch, etc., the general public has no idea what you're talking about. Most of them haven't heard of these things, and they probably won't look into it. So there is a wide gap between TIs and the audience or the general public. So part of bridging the gap is to give a basic explanation of some of the TI's main topics, so that the audience can have a basic idea of what the TIs are talking about. New TIs can also have a basic understanding of what they are experiencing. Both will have a better understanding so that each can make a better decision on whether or not to look deeper into the issue. So, new TIs probably should look into the issue because it's something that affects them more than the general public, but it's something that they're more aware of and more aware of its effects than the general public. And then the general public could see, whether or not this is something they want to look into because it affects them, whether or not they want to admit it, or whether or not they know it. Because if you don't know, you're just a sitting duck. But anyway, so that's why I'm doing this. So let me just give a commentary on the first 15 minutes. So the author believes in a mindless newborn brain, meaning that the newborn is a blank slate. The author believes that the neonate, or commonly known as the newborn, is reflexive or instinctual. It has natural reflex reactions like sneezing or the knee kick when the right spot is hit. Like when you go to doctors, they hit a certain part of your knee kind of like bumps up a little bit. So they think everything is just instinctual and reflexive. There's no mind or reason. In it, he said that there were some newborns born without a brain or only parts of a brain, and they're also known as anencephalic. That word's hard for me. Anencephalic, anencephalic babies. They lived only a few days, but were able to act like normal babies, with the main difference being that they weren't able to develop new behaviors quickly. They were stuck at whatever they were born with. Then he goes into different experiments and theories. This chapter is kind of dry, but bear with me. That's why I skipped the first 5 chapters, because even though they give a good background, if you're not familiar with this field of study, it just sounds like gibberish to you. So once you finish reading or listening to this book, and maybe going into more depth by looking up information on your own, and feel like you have a firm basic understanding. I mean, I'm not going to make you experts by the time we finish this book, but you're going to have a basic understanding, and you can go back and read those 5 chapters, and it will probably make more sense to you, and you probably won't fall asleep while reading them. So what I don't want TIs to watch other TI videos and just regurgitate what the videos say. I want TIs to be able to watch those videos, understand, question, and discuss what those videos say. Remember that gang stalkers pretend to be TIs, and a lot of them pretend to be smart. They could be saying stuff, and the TI may be repeating what they say and look stupid. I'm trying to give you a better understanding so that you can better decide what to repeat, what to look into a bit deeper, and what is just BS. It's worth your time, even though it is a bit boring. So, with that, let's get into the next 15 minutes.
Increase in the number and connections of neurons should also have obvious consequences. Many years ago, the great Spanish histologist Cajal suggested that cerebral activity could be correlated with the ramifications of cerebral neurons, and he drew attention to the small cells rich in synaptic connections. The total brain mass should be less important than its internal organization and wealth of connections for the exchange of information. Cajal knew that a talented person or even a genius did not necessarily have a large brain. Quality, rather than total volume, is crucial. It is generally accepted that the brain of a newborn human baby is incomplete to a remarkable degree. In the primary sensory areas and the motor cortex, many characteristics, including myelination, cortical width, and the number and size of cells, are in an embryonic state. While anatomical maturation must influence brain functions, it is doubtful whether it is the decisive factor in mental activity. The limited role of maturation is illustrated by the behavior of premature babies, born after 7 months of intrauterine life. 2 months after birth, their reactions are more similar to those of a normal, full-term 2-month-old baby than to a newborn. It is also true that although the pyramidal tract does not mature for 2 years, children are able to coordinate, walk, and perform voluntary movements many months before. If a human being could grow physically for several years under complete sensory deprivation, it could be ascertained whether the appearance of mental activity is dependent upon extragenetic, extracerebral elements. My prediction is that such a being would not have mental functions. His brain would be empty and void of ideas. He would be without memory and incapable of understanding his surroundings. Such a person, although maturing physically, would remain as mentally naive as on the day of his birth. This experiment is, of course, unfeasible. It would be unacceptable ethically, and it is technically impossible, because even if sight, sound, taste, and olfaction could be blocked, touch and visceral proprioception extend throughout most of the body and could not be completely suppressed. Although the final proof of this extreme experiment will never be forthcoming, we have partial medical proof of the adverse effects of sensory deprivation on physiological development of children. It is known that people who have lived for several years without a sensory receptor lack the mental functions related to the receptor that must transduce, bias, and pass on the incoming information. Some babies have been born with congenital cataracts in both eyes, but have not suffered atrophy of the optic nerve. They grow up without any visual experience of shapes, objects, or patterns, being able to perceive only diffused light. During childhood, they learn to recognize surroundings by touch and by ear. They can identify a book, glass, or chair, and know people by their footsteps or voices. When some of these blind children were 12 to 14 years old, their cataracts were removed, and for the first time they could see the physical world. During the first days, this visible world had no significance, and familiar objects, such as a walking stick or favorite chair, were recognized only when explored manually. A tedious learning process was necessary before these children could learn to evaluate lights and shades and interpret the barrage of optic sensations which were initially so confusing. After a long training period, their visual recognition improved considerably, but it remained permanently impaired. For example, the distinction between a square and a hexagon required laborious and often erroneous manual counting of the corners. And a rooster was confused with a horse because both have tails. A very intelligent blind boy, whose sight was restored when he was 11, identified a fish as a camel because he confused its dorsal fin with a camel's hump. Although this clinical data is based on a small number of patients, some of whom may have had brain lesions as well as cataracts, the results indicate that the ability to perceive patterns does not pre-exist in cerebral organization, but is learned through experience, and that in man, the early postnatal period is of decisive importance in the acquisition of cerebral mechanisms for the perception and symbolization of sensory stimuli. In agreement with the results of visual deprivation in patients is the very poor performance of native African children in the Form Board Intelligence Test. The natives were far superior to white men in detecting hunting tracks in the forest, but were completely unfamiliar with and unable to discriminate between the geometrical patterns used in the test. These findings illustrate that visual discrimination is one mental activity which must be learned, and that in the human brain, cerebral development and organization are not sufficient for the performance of mental functions. Genetic factors are not enough. Experience is essential. At conception, individuals are quite alike in intellectual endowment. It is the life experience and the sociocultural milieu influencing biological and psychological function which makes human beings significantly different from each other. The decisive role of infantile experiences in the development of individual personality and its disorders was the main theme of Freud's historic investigations, which have shaped the thinking of psychologists, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and laymen to the present time. The central experience of the period of childhood is the infant relation to his mother, and the events of the first years leave a much greater mark on physiological and behavioral characteristics than those which occur later in life. Piaget also has stressed that the first 18 months of life are crucial for the establishment of sensory motor intelligence and for the formation of the ego. Perhaps the most dramatic evidence that the capacity to love is not inherited but may appear at first sight is the process of imprinting. As Lawrence's show, the young of some bird species become attached to the first moving object they perceive. Normally, this object is their mother, but in his work with ducks, Lawrence presented himself at the moment of hatching as the mother substitute. The little ducklings were imprinted with the image of Dr. Lawrence and followed him obediently with apparent filial affection. The strength of bonds established in the young depend on the qualities of the stimulus, shape, sounds, odors, and on the timing of the reception. In the duck, the most effective imprinting takes place soon after hatching, while beyond a certain age, it cannot take place at all. The studies of the Harlows in rhesus monkeys confirmed the decisive importance of early sensory inputs as determinants of behavior, and also the existence of a critical period early after birth for establishment of the capacity for affection. Deprivation incurred by isolating baby monkeys from their mothers or peers irreversibly blighted the animal's capacity for social adjustments. The period between the third and sixth months was found to be most critical for their development. Animals deprived of contact during this phase exhibited aberrant behavior, which persisted throughout their adulthood, even when they were placed within control groups. The behavioral abnormalities included staring fixedly into space, stereotyped motility, clasping their heads in their hands, rocking for long periods of time, development of compulsive habits, self-aggressive tendencies with self-inflicted body damage, and abnormal sexuality with unsuccessful mating. In monkeys, the ability to love is not inherited, and if it is not learned during early life, the deprived individual forever loses the capacity to establish bonds of affection and remains socially and sexually aberrant. In another series of experiments, it was demonstrated that the ability to solve problems without fumbling is not inborn, but is acquired gradually. When monkeys faced a simple discrimination test, such as selection of an object according to its color or shape for the reward of raisins or peanuts, learning was initially haphazard. After the animals had learned to solve several similar problems, their behavior changed dramatically, and they showed increasing insight until eventually, when faced with a new problem, they could solve it in a single trial. Parallel studies have been performed with children, showing that in man, as in monkeys, there is no evidence of any innate endowment that enables them to solve instrumental problems. The conclusions of these findings are that animals, human and subhuman, must learn to think. Thinking does not develop spontaneously as an expression of innate abilities. It is the end result of a long learning process. And that the brain is essential to thought, but the untutored brain is not enough, no matter how good a brain it may be. The classical controversy about the nature-nurture dichotomy has lost its original simplicity. The problem is not to separate innate from learned behavioral patterns, because in most cases there is a reciprocal influence between pre-existing and acquired factors. The problem is to identify the specific roles and mechanisms in the collaborative effort between heredity and environment. To be specific, let us consider language as the most outstanding manifestation of human mental qualities. The potentiality to talk depends on genetic factors which exist in man at the moment of birth, while they are lacking in the rest of the zoological scale, including the big apes. It is known that after the most patient training, some chimpanzees living with human foster parents have been able to pronounce a few simple words, such as papa and mama and cup, but they have never learned to converse or to say complex phrases. Language potentiality in the human baby signifies the existence of a functioning brain that can be trained to store information and also to combine, modify, and use it for performance of the specific function of talking. Potentiality is like a beautiful highway, able to accommodate traffic and facilitate the exchange of visitors among many cities. The highway, however, cannot create cars, trucks, merchandise, businessmen, workers, and all the life which circulates along it. The road makes functions possible, but by itself, it is a useless stretch of pavement. The potential of verbal communication is not enough to learn to talk, and it is necessary to be repeatedly exposed to sensory inputs from an environment which includes family and friends. The baby brain does not invent language, nor can it choose to learn either English or Chinese. It is entirely dependent on information which must come from the outside. The genetic structure of the individual establishes the mechanisms for receiving and handling the inputs, and in the case of language, it may also be responsible for the modulation of accessory elements of speech, such as tone and inflection of voice, and for the facilitation of some tendencies related to learning of words and formation of concepts. But if a baby is not exposed to language, then there are no materials to be received, modulated, or facilitated, and his potentialities will remain dormant. This is true for many other mental functions, which will not appear in the absence of appropriate sensory inputs. An important point is that the choice of the necessary information cannot be made by the baby himself, because at the beginning, he is completely helpless and dependent. The decisive responsibilities of providing information to structure the initial organization of the baby's mind is assumed by those in charge of the infant. As stated by Geertz, there is no such thing as a human nature independent of culture. Men without culture would not be the clever savages of Golding's Lord of the Flies. They would not be, as classical anthropological theory would imply, intrinsically talented apes who had somehow failed to find themselves. Instead, they would be monstrosities with few useful instincts, fewer recognizable sentiments, and no intellect. Chapter 7: Sensory Dependence of the Adult Mind.
Okay. So before we get into chapter 7, if you decide to look into this, there was like a wealth of information in that 15 minutes. It's just incredible. It's kind of funny because this is like your first time hearing it, but since I had to hear it one time to make notes and stuff, this is my second time. I'm like, whoa. Anyway, but I'm a nerd, so if you're not a nerd, or if you're not there's different kinds of nerds. You could be a tech nerd, you could be a biology nerd, you could be a physics nerd. If you're not my kind of nerd, it's probably not your thing. But anyway, my type of nerd. All right, so let's go over that 15 minutes. So what it basically says, a large brain doesn't mean intelligence. The quality of the mind is more important. Thinking is developed and it's not innate. So you're not born knowing how to do math. Okay, that's something you learn. Or you're not born, learning how to do puzzles. That's something that you learn. So having a brain does not mean that you can think or you are intelligent. This is common knowledge. Now, if you were a psychopathic scientist bent on controlling everyone around you, how can you use that common knowledge to help your agenda? Science is a power field that can attract many psychopaths because scientists have intellectual clout just by holding the title, although some are charlatans. So if you go up to someone, you're like, I'm a scientist, they automatically think you're smart, even if you're not. So they also study how nature works. Scientists also study how nature works, and nature is the powerful force that controls the world. You get the picture? I didn't come to the following conclusion on my own, but after observing the extreme psychopaths in the gang stalking network, and I think that's important because I just don't want you to know I'm sitting around thinking of these diabolical things. What I'm telling you is through observation, and it blows my mind because I just don't think like that. I was raised in a human society. So some of the things these beasts do is just like, whoa. It takes me a while to get it. But once I get it, I can explain it to you. So that's what that sentence is about. It's the stuff that they do is so disturbing is that I don't want to claim that I thought it up. Anyway, so let's go back. Common knowledge says that having a brain doesn't mean you can think, assuming that thinking means having reasoning and intellectual abilities, right? So, however, having a brain means that you could be a functional human being. You can do things. And that's what you can do things. Let's leave it simple. So you learned earlier that most babies born without a brain die. So that could mean that most of the population that is still living has a fully developed brain and are fully functional. If they don't think, then they just do. If they don't think, then they will probably just do as they are told. As a psychopathic scientist, that is what you want, a fully functional group of people who don't think so you can tell them what to do. So earlier, you learned about experiments done to interfere with people and animals' mental development. That was the first 15 minutes. Most of these were done by altering the environment, and some occurred naturally. So keep all this in mind as the book will go into using technology to affect the mind. So even though, like I said, this first half hour is dense, okay, the first few 15 minutes are going to be dense, but it all it circles back and it's going to make sense later. So back to what we were saying. The book says that the baby brain is entirely dependent on information that comes from the outside. If the non-thinking brain is similar to the baby brain, that leaves so much possibility for someone controlling the mind. Going back to what was learned about narcissists and psychopaths in the previous weeks, Mr. Mellon, the husband, kept his wife in a state of distress so that she couldn't think. Even though he couldn't technologically regress her to a baby brain, he psychologically interfered with or tried to stop her thinking. So I think so. If we go back to cognitive dissonance, her mind just got so jumbled that she was just like, I can't think. And she didn't even want to think because it kind of like hurt because she was so confused, right? Her head was hurting and stuff. So she stopped thinking. So the discomfort of cognitive dissonance usually stops people from thinking or thinking too much. This can lead to not thinking, which can lead to a non-thinking brain that can easily be controlled because the baby brain or non-thinking brain is entirely dependent on information that comes from the outside. From the outside. Okay. The baby brain or non thinking brain is entirely dependent on information that comes from the outside, which means someone else tells you what is real, shapes your reality, or controls your mind. The statement in the book was specific to language development, but later the book says it's true for many mental functions. You can listen to that section again during the replay. So that kind of like gives you some background, some scientific background, even though I don't think psychopaths are thinking about it scientifically, unless, they're psychologists or maybe like scientists who study the mind and stuff. I don't think they're sitting there like, oh, I'm going to do this and that. They don't, because they're predators. They kind of like learn. Oh my God, it's kind of scary, isn't it? It's kind of like instinctual for them to like do this to you because they have that predatory mindset. So I hope that kind of explains a little bit about why they don't want you to think. Because if you don't think, they can tell you what to do. So that's why, like, psychopaths always try to get their victims in a state of distress, in a state where they don't want to think, they don't want to do anything, they just want to like, just leave me alone, just leave me alone, because then you're more apt to do when you don't think. Okay, I feel like I'm being repetitive, but let's go on to the next 15 minutes.
Even if reception of sensory information is accepted as totally essential for the onset and development of mental functions, it is more or less explicitly assumed that an adult has a well established mental capacity which functions with relative independence of the environment. Individuality, initiative, and free will are expressed in the ability to accept or reject ideas and select behavioral responses. A man can isolate himself, meditate, and explore the depths of his own thoughts. To a great extent, education, especially in Occidental cultures, is based on the belief that individual personality is a self contained and relatively independent entity with its own destiny, well differentiated from the surroundings, and able to function by itself even when isolated from Earth and traveling in an orbiting capsule. A more detailed analysis of reality, however, shows that cerebral activity is essentially dependent on sensory inputs from the environment not only at birth, but also throughout life. Normal mental functions cannot be preserved in the absence of a stream of information coming from the outside world. The mature brain, with all its wealth of past experience and acquired skills, is not capable of maintaining the thinking process or even normal awareness and reactivity in a vacuum of sensory deprivation. The individual mind is not self sufficient. Support for this statement derives from neurophysiological and psychological experimentation. In mammals, the central organization of motor activity is localized in special regions of the cerebral cortex, where muscles and ideokinetic formulas are represented. The motor pathways descend through the spinal cord and emerge through the ventral roots to form plexus and motor nerves. As should be expected, experimental destruction in animals or pathological damage in man of the ventral roots produces complete motor paralysis because the cerebral impulses cannot reach the muscle target. Considering the input side, we know that all sensory information from the periphery, including proprioceptive impulses from the muscles, is carried by the dorsal roots of the spinal cord. As anticipated, destruction of all dorsal roots produces a loss of sensation. But in addition, there is also a paralysis of the musculature as pronounced as when the motor roots are interrupted. These experiments show that in the absence of sensory information, motor activity is totally disrupted. The brain and motor pathways are not sufficient in themselves, and for proper motor behavior, sensory inputs are absolutely necessary. The studies of Sprague in the cat confirmed the importance of incoming information for normal functioning of the brain. These authors destroyed the lateral portion of the upper midbrain, including the main sensory pathways, and they observed that, in addition to the expected marked sensory deficit, the cats exhibited a lack of affect, aggression, and pleasurable responses, and did not solicit petting. The animals remained mute, expressionless, and showed minimal autonomic responses. But in spite of this passivity, they showed hyper-exploratory activity with incessant stereotyped wandering, sniffing, and searching as if hallucinating. Without a patterned afferent input to the forebrain via the lemnisci, the remaining portions of the central nervous system seem incapable of elaborating a large part of the animal's repertoire of adaptive behavior. Psychological data also confirm the essential importance of continuous reception of inputs. Experiments on sensory deprivation in animals and man have shown that maintenance of normal mental activity is difficult or impossible when sensory information is reduced and, moreover, that monotonous sensation is aversive. Animals and humans require novelty and continual and varied stimulation from their surroundings. Perception of the environment has positive reinforcing properties, and when monkeys were confined in a cage, they would press levers and perform other instrumental responses for the reward of opening a little window and looking at the outside world. Curiosity derives from expectancy of novel sensory stimulation and motivates exploratory behavior in both animals and man, while boredom has negative reinforcing properties and is related to the absence of novel sensory inputs. To be entertained means to be provided with new and changing sensations, mainly visual and auditory. Primitive man probably derived pleasure from looking at the changing beauty of nature, which retains its fascination to the present day. Civilization has provided the technical means for a far greater choice of inputs, and a major portion of our time, effort, mental activity, and economic resources are now devoted to entertainment through books, theaters, radio, television, museums, and other cultural media. Symbolically, we may speak about psychic energy as the level of intracerebral activity which could perhaps be identified in neurophysiological terms by electrical and chemical processes located at specific neuronal fields. This psychic energy may be considered a main determinant of the quantity of intellectual and behavioral manifestations. While this energy obviously depends on cerebral physiology and indirectly on the health of the whole body, its actual source is extracerebral because mental activity is not a property of neurons, but is contingent on the received information which activates stored information and past experiences, creating emotions and ideas. To be alone with our own mind is not enough. Even if all past experiences are included, the exclusion of new perceptions creates serious functional difficulties. This has been shown, for instance, in the studies of Hebb and his group, in which college students were asked to lie comfortably on beds in soundproof, lighted cubicles, wearing translucent goggles to minimize optic sensation, and gloves with cardboard cuffs to limit tactual perception. The purpose of this isolation experiment was not to cut out all sensory information, but only to remove patterns and symbolic information. Most of the subjects expected to spend their idle time alone reviewing their studies, planning term papers, or organizing ideas for lectures. The surprising result, for the investigators as well as for the participants, was that the students were unable to think clearly about anything for any length of time, and their thought process
Mm.
seemed to be affected in other ways. After several hours of isolation, many of them began to see images, such as a rock shaded by a tree, a procession of squirrels, or prehistoric animals walking about in a jungle. Initially, the subjects were surprised and amused, but after a while, their hallucinations became disturbing and vivid enough to interfere with sleep. The students had little control over these phenomena, which, in some cases, included acoustic as well as optic perceptions, such as people talking, a music box playing, or a choir singing in full stereophonic sound. Some subjects reported sensations of movement or touch, or feelings of otherness, or that another body was lying beside them on the bed. Isolation also tended to increase the belief in supernatural phenomena, and several of the students reported that for a few days after their isolation experiment, they were afraid that they were going to see ghosts. The conclusion was that a changing sensory environment seems essential for human beings. Without it, the brain ceases to function in an adequate way and abnormalities of behavior develop. In patients with long term hospital confinement in bed or in an iron lung or body cast, psychotic like symptoms have appeared, including anxiety, delusions, and hallucinations, which did not respond to standard medical or psychiatric treatment, but were easily alleviated by social contact or by sensory stimulation from a radio or television set. In our century, the classic punishment of solitary confinement has been used with sleep deprivation and used in psychological warfare. Exhaustion and decreased sensory inputs are known to cause mental disturbances and reduce defense mechanisms, and they have been effectively manipulated during brainwashing or thought reform procedures to indoctrinate prisoners. The literature on sensory deprivation is voluminous and shows conclusively that the cerebral cortex requires a stream of stimulation for the preservation of behavioral and mental normality. We should realize, therefore, that our cerebral and mental functions rely on the umbilical cord of sensory inputs and become disrupted if isolated from the environment. This fact has been recognized by philosophers and is reflected in the words of Ortega y Gasset, who wrote, "Man has no nature. What he has is a history," and "I am I and my circumstance." The recognition of environmental inputs as a part of personal identity is one of the important contributions of Ortega, and this idea is presented in Meditations on Quixote, when one of the characters states that circumstantial reality forms the other half of my person, and reabsorption of circumstances is the specific destiny of man. A similar thought is expressed in Tennyson's poem Ulysses, when Ulysses says, "I am a part of all that I have met." Ortega's position is important to philosophical thinking. Of that half of personal identity thought not to originate in the environment. If we could erase all individual history, all circumstances and experiences, would there be anything left of our personality? The brain would remain and neuronal nets would perhaps continue their spiking activity, but devoid of history, of past experiences and knowledge, there could be no mental activity, and the mind would, in fact, be an Aristotelian tabula rasa. Let us remember with Dobzhansky that genes determine not characters or traits, but reactions or response. The frame of reference and the building blocks of our personality are the materials received from the outside. The role of cerebral mechanisms, which to a great extent are also determined by previous experience, is to receive, bias, combine, and store the received information, but not to create it. Originality is the discovery of novel associations between previously received information. We must realize that the anatomical structure of the brain has not evolved perceptibly in the past several millenniums of man's history. What has changed is the amount of information received by the brain and the training to deal with it. The major differences between a caveman and a modern scientist are not genetic, but environmental and cultural. For centuries, philosophical tradition has accepted the existence of the I, soul, or ego as an entity, more or less metaphysical, relatively independent of the environment, and perhaps even of the genes, which is the essence that endows individual man with his unique personal identity and characteristics, and may later be threatened or disallowed by the social medium. The concept of this mythical I is so strong that it has permeated the thinking of authors as original and revolutionary as Marcuse. In One Dimensional Man, he distinguishes between true and false needs, declaring, false are those which are superimposed upon the individual by particular social interest in his repression. Most of the prevailing needs to relax, to have fun, to behave and consume in accordance with the advertisements, to love and hate what others love and hate, belong to the category of false needs, which are determined by external forces over which the individual has no control. The only needs that have an unqualified claim for satisfaction are the vital ones: nourishment, clothing, lodging. According to Marcuse, inner freedom designates the private space in which man may become and remain himself. Today, the private space has been invaded and whittled down by technological reality. The basic questions are obviously, who is this himself? And what is the origin of its structural elements? Is there any way to provide the experience which will form a baby's mind, except by the means of the external powers of parents, teachers, and culture, over which the baby has no control? Are we then going to classify a child's needs as false because they were inculcated? Where is the inner man? Marcuse's pleas for intellectual freedom and his criticism of material and intellectual needs that perpetuate obsolete forms of the struggle for existence are certainly valid. But the state of unqualified liberty cannot be supposed to exist for the infant who is totally dependent physically and psychologically on his surroundings. Freedom must be taught and created. The mutual.
All right. Isn't this fun? It's like sitting in a lecture. I like his voice. It's like listening to professor talk. But like I said, maybe it's not your thing. Let's see. All right. So before I said that the predatory nature of a psychopath is instinctual, I may have misspoke. It might be instinctual, but I have observed things that suggest that the predatory impulse is not nature, but could be nurture, or the predatory impulse of psychopaths and narcissists can be learned. So I wanted to clarify that. So back to this 15 minutes. So a sentence that is interesting that he read was, exhaustion and decreased sensory inputs are known to cause mental disturbances and reduce defense mechanisms. And if you brought up the PDF that I gave you the link to, that's on page 10. So now we're in chapter 7. So now you could actually go back and read. You could read along if you want. I found it frustrating. Like when I was listening, I kind of got frustrated because there were some things I wanted to look at, and I had to like go back and like rewind the MP4. And it got annoying. But then when I found this PDF, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have to. So you could go back and read it. I'll tell you where the pages are. So anyway, okay, let's start over. So a sentence that is interesting in the book is, exhaustion and decreased sensory inputs are known to cause mental disturbances and reduce defense mechanisms, and that's on page 10. The sensory inputs part is important because when I go subliminal, I hear a lot about getting the senses. It seems like they're obsessed with getting senses, and I never understood what that meant until I learned a bit more about their really cringeworthy environment, and then I understood why they want your senses. beast, right? And it's scary when you hear it in the subliminal environment, right? Because you hear like a voice saying that, you're like, oh my God. But anyway, so going subliminal is all about electronic harassment and observing the beast in their subliminal world, which is quite different from reality. It's like a horror film. I still can't believe it's real. So the book also mentions that a person's history shapes his or her mind. It says we must realize that the anatomical structure of the brain has not evolved perceptibly in the past several millenniums of man's history. What has changed is the amount of information received by the brain and the training to deal with it. The major differences between a caveman and a modern scientist are not genetic, but environmental and cultural. See, that's it, and that's on page 11. That's very interesting. And the training to deal with it. Okay. So I'm not going to go into that. So there has been no significant, he's saying that there has been no significant structural change in the brain since the caveman days. There has been only environmental and cultural differences that have allowed advancements. What could that mean? What could that mean? It means that if the environment and culture that has allowed progress is removed, then the primitive mind or the caveman mentality will appear. So what? A beast actually called the gang stalking network a subculture. That was the first time I ever heard like anything being described as a subculture. Um, and TIs have seen their environments. The TI's environments have changed as the beasts move in, isolate the TI from the real world. Basically, trying to regress the TI to the primitive mind and then to the non thinking mind. What does that have to do with electronic harassment? Scientists like to give, so what does that have to do with electronic harassment? So scientists like to give a background to whatever the main topic is. And that's pretty much what we've been doing from chapter 7. Chapter 1 through 5, actually chapter 1 through 7 is basically the background. Delgado's giving you a background into his research. He hasn't even really talked about what he's done yet, but scientists like to do that. And you know what? It makes sense. It's like when you watch a movie, you gotta like in the first parts of the movie, you're kind of like meeting the characters, you're learning a little bit about them, and it's kind of dull, right? It was not dull, but you know, you're just like, but it's since movies nowadays are really social. So since you're like a social being, you're like, oh my God, it's like meeting someone, except you're meeting a character, right? And books, fictional books do that. And then you get into the action. This is pretty much it. It's just that a lot of people don't like science, and that hurts my feelings, but a lot of people don't like science. A lot of people don't really get science, but this is pretty much it. Delgado's kind of like introducing you to his research. He's introducing you to his research by like talking about stuff that's come before, stuff that's relevant to his research. And like I said, it's slow and it's dull, but it's necessary. Like the first parts of the movie where you're meeting the character, you're learning about the character, and then the action begins, right? So it may seem long, boring, and irrelevant, but once they get to the point, it will all make sense. So keep listening. It will all come together. And yeah. I don't know if what I just explained about the beast. So I mean, I feel like I need to clarify that. So I said that the beast, if you remove means environment, culture, progress. Okay. So what I think the beasts are doing is that when they get a TI and they isolate the TI and then they surround the TI with nothing but beasts, because a lot of TIs, sometimes you feel like you go out and all you see are beasts. There are humans there. I don't know if it was intro to gang stalking on Tenani, but one of them goes into no, it was one of the Tenani episodes, and they do the M&M experiments, which is really good because I think it'll help you feel better. I forgot what it was though. So if you see, I think on the thumbnail, it has a picture of M&Ms, but it's just to show you that it's kind of to show you like how you're just surrounded by bees, but all outside the little circle of bees, there's like human society that you're so used to, you love, and you grew up in. So just remember that. So what I think happened is like if you see TIs, you grew up in a human society surrounded by humans. Once you start getting gang stalked, what's going to happen are the beasts are going to move in and kind of surround you. So they're removing you from that culture an environment that you're used to. And by doing that, they're kind of like trying to remove what you've learned. And if all that's removed, you're kind of like back to the primitive mind, because here you are in an environment that you've never been. Like, not a lot psychopaths wear a human mask, and not a lot of people get to see psychopaths without their human mask. So as a TI, you're in an environment where you see psychopaths without their mask on, and it's scary as hell, right? You're just like, what the heck? What kind of people are these? And in that way, the culture and environment that you're used to is gone, and you're kind of like a baby in a new environment. So you're kind of like back to, like, I don't want to say primitive, you're kind of like relying on your instincts and stuff, because this environment, you haven't learned how to cope in it yet. So that's why I feel like sometimes, and that's why I guess that's what I'm trying to kind of explain. It's like when they surround you and stuff, they kind of regress you to the primitive mind, because they're moving your culture, they're moving your environment and what you're used to. So you're kind of like back to baby status, because here you are around a bunch of people and in a world where you're just like, oh my God, I don't know what this is. I don't know what to do. So that's what I was trying to explain. And I hope I clarified. So with that, okay, so that was the first few 15 minutes. And it's gonna get better. I think this is part of the last of the boring not boring. I know you're gonna think, I don't think it's boring, but you're gonna think it's boring. But let me just get to it.
Dependence of the mutual dependence of the individual and the psychic environment has been elaborated by Tyler Desjardins, who wrote that the universal and personal grow in the same direction and culminate simultaneously in each other. The hyperpersonal consciousness at the omega point. While it is true that each of us personally receives, interprets, and feels the world around us, why should our individual half be opposed to the noospheric half? Taylor Desjardins, like Ortega y Gasset and most other philosophers, accepts the existence of the quasi-mystical, inviolable self, an entity somehow identified with the individual mind, ego, or personality, which is related to the environment but has a relatively independent existence. Recent neurophysiological and psychological studies discussed here reveal that this is not the case. The origin of memories, emotional reactivity, motor skills, words, ideas, and behavioral patterns, which constitute our personal self, can be traced to outside of the individual. Each person is a transitory composite of materials borrowed from the environment, and his mind is the intracerebral elaboration of extracerebral information. The personal half is a regrouping of elements of the environment. For the final result, which is manifested as individual reactivity and behavioral responses, the building blocks from culture are more decisive than the individual substratum within which the regrouping is performed. It is impressive that this is actually the philosophy, as described by Levi Strauss, of the Bororo Indians, a very primitive tribe living by the Vermelho River in the Amazon jungles of Brazil. For the Bororo, a man is not an individual, but a part of a sociological universe. Their villages exist for all eternity, forming part of the physical universe, along with other animate beings, celestial bodies, and meteorological phenomena. Human shape is transitory, midway between that of the fish and the arara. Human life is merely a department of culture. Death is both natural and anti-cultural. And whenever a native dies, damage is inflicted not only on his relatives, but on society as a whole. Nature claims that they must pay the debt. Therefore, a collective hunt is organized to kill some sizable animal, if possible, a jaguar, in order to bring home its skin, teeth, and nails, which will constitute the dead man's mori, his everlasting personal value. The conclusion that human beings are part of culture does not deny that individuals have individual reactions, and that their brains are unique combinations of elements, but simply points to the source and quality of the factors of personal identity. The cerebral mechanisms which allow us to receive, interpret, feel, and react, as well as the extracerebral sources of stimuli, can and should be investigated experimentally. Then, We shall gain a new awareness of the structure of the individual and its relations with the surrounding noosphere. Chapter 8. Working Hypothesis for the Experimental Study of the Mind. One of the most important consequences of recent scientific discoveries is the new attitude toward the course of human life. This attitude has modified our traditional acceptance of fatalistic determination by unknown factors related to heredity, body functions, and environment, and has intensified the search for knowledge and technology to direct our lives more intelligently. The genetic code is being unraveled, introducing the possibility that sometime in the future we may be able to influence heredity in order to avoid illnesses like Mongolism, or in order to promote transmission of specific anatomical and functional characteristics. Neurophysiological investigation has established correlations between mental phenomena and physiochemical changes in the central nervous system, and specific electrical responses of different areas of the brain can be identified following sensory stimulation of the eye with patterns, shapes, or movements. Advances in other scientific areas have proved that mental functions and human behavior can be modified by surgery, frontal lobotomy, by electronics, brain stimulation, and by chemistry, drug administration, thus placing the mind within experimental reach. The ability to influence mental activity by direct manipulation of cerebral structures is certainly novel in the history of man, and present objectives are not only to increase our understanding of the neurophysiological basis of mind, but also to influence cerebral mechanisms by means of instrumental manipulation. The working hypotheses may be summarized as follows. 1. There are basic mechanisms in the brain responsible for all mental activities, including perceptions, emotions, abstract thought, social relations, and the most refined artistic creations. 2. These mechanisms may be detected, analyzed, influenced, and sometimes substituted for by means of physical and chemical technology. This approach does not claim that love or thoughts are exclusively neurophysiological phenomena, but accepts the obvious fact that the central nervous system is absolutely necessary for any behavioral manifestation. It plans to study the mechanisms involved. 3. Predictable behavior and mental responses may be induced by direct manipulation of the brain. 4. We can substitute intelligent and purposeful determination of neuronal functions for blind, automatic responses. In any evaluation of experimental results, we should remember that there is always a congruence between the methodological approach and findings obtained, in the sense that if we study the brain with an oscilloscope, we can expect information about spike potentials and other electrical data, but not about the chemical composition of the neurons. Psychological reactions and behavioral performance often escape neurophysiological methodology, and a coordinated interdisciplinary approach is needed. Music does not exist in a single note, but is the product of a spatio-temporal sequence of many sounds. Mental activity does not emanate from the activity of single neurons, but from the interaction of many neuronal fields. Rage, for example, is characterized by changes in electrochemical, autonomic, sensory, and motor functions, which are overtly expressed in social relations. Some electrical manifestations of rage have been recorded as discharges at the single neuronal level, but the phenomenon involves multi-level responses, and for its proper investigation, the whole organism should be observed in a social setting. The development of new methodology to explore and communicate with the depth of the brain while the experimental subject engages in spontaneous or evoked activities now enables the scientist to analyze and control basic neurological mechanisms of the mind and represents a unique means of understanding the material and functional basis of individual structure. The future should see collaboration between those investigators who formerly studied neuronal physiology while disregarding behavior, and other scientists who have been interested in behavior while ignoring the brain. The future should see collaboration between those investigators who formerly studied neuronal physiology while disregarding behavior, and other scientists who have been interested in behavior while ignoring the brain. Chapter 9. Historical Evolution of Physical Control of the Brain. Experimental fact. Frog muscle contracted when stimulated by electricity. Volta, 1800. Galvani, 1791. Dubois-Raymond, 1848. Implication. Vital spirits are not essential for biological activities. Electrical stimuli under man's control can initiate and modify vital processes. Fact. Electrical stimulation of the brain in anesthetized dog evoked localized body and limb movements. Fritz and Hitzig, 1870. Implication. The brain is excitable. Electrical stimulation of the cerebral cortex can produce movements. Fact. Stimulation of the diencephalon in unanesthetized cats evoked well-organized motor effects and emotional reactions. Hess, 1932. Implication. Motor and emotional manifestations may be evoked by electrical stimulation of the brain in awake animals. Fact. In single animals, learning, conditioning, instrumental responses, pain, and pleasure have been evoked or inhibited by electrical stimulation of the brain in rats, cats, and monkeys. Delgado, 1954. Olds and Milner, 1954. Implication. Psychological phenomena may be controlled by electrical stimulation of specific areas of the brain. Fact. In colonies of cats and monkeys, aggression, dominance, mounting, and other social interactions have been evoked, modified, or inhibited by radiostimulation of specific cerebral areas. Delgado, 1955-1964. Implication. Social behavior may be controlled by radiostimulation of specific areas of the brain. Fact. In patients, brain stimulation during surgical interventions or with electrodes implanted for days or months has blocked the thinking process, inhibited speech and movement, or in other cases has evoked pleasure, laughter, friendliness, verbal output, hostility, fear, hallucinations, and memories. Delgado, 1952-1968. Penfield and Jasper, 1954. Rainey and O'Doherty, 1960. Implication. Human mental functions may be influenced by electrical stimulation of specific areas of the brain. Summary. Autonomic and somatic functions, individual and social behavior, emotional and mental reactions may be evoked, maintained, modified, or inhibited, both in animals and in man, by electrical stimulation of specific cerebral structures. Physical control of many brain functions is a demonstrated fact, but the possibilities and limits of this control are still little known. Part 3. Experimental control of brain functions in behaving subjects. In our present technological environment, we are used to the idea that machines can be controlled from a distance by means of radio signals. The doors of a garage can be opened or closed by pushing a button in our car. The channels and volume of a television set can be adjusted by pressing the corresponding knobs of a small telecommand instrument without moving from a comfortable armchair. And even orbiting capsules can now be directed from tracking stations on Earth. These accomplishments should familiarize us with the idea that we may also control the biological functions of living organisms from a distance. Cats, monkeys, or human beings can be induced to flex a limb, to reject food, or to feel emotional excitement under the influence of electrical impulses reaching the depths of their brains through radio waves purposefully sent by an investigator. This reality has introduced a variety of scientific and philosophical questions, and to understand the significance, potentials, and limitations of brain control, it is convenient to review briefly the basis for normal behavioral activity and the methodology for its possible artificial modification, and then to consider some representative examples of electrical control of behavior in both animals and man. Chapter 10. Physicochemical bases of behavioral activity. In the vegetable as well as in the animal kingdom, the dynamics of biological processes are related to ionic movements and electrical charges across the membranes which separate cells from the surrounding medium. For example, during the process of photosynthesis, the leaf of a tree captures energy from the sun and a negative potential is created on its receptive surface. In a similar manner, activation of a squid axon, a frog muscle, or the human brain is accompanied by a negative wave which invades cellular membranes and then disappears. This transmembrane change of potential induces a flow of electrical currents into the cellular cytoplasm and surrounding conducting fluids. Cellular activity may therefore be investigated by recording the electrical potentials appearing across the membranes or by detecting differences in potential which appear in the extracellular fluid, even if the recording electrodes are placed at a considerable distance from the electromotive source. This is the basic principle of recording electrical activity of the heart, as by an electrocardiogram or EKG, through electrodes placed on the extremities, or of studying electrical potentials of the brain, as with an electroencephalogram or EEG, by means of leads attached to the scalp. If electrodes are placed closer to the source of negativity, for example, in the depth of the brain, recordings will be more accurate and may reveal the location of generators of electrical activity. Conversely, by using an external potential, an electrical field may be established through the extracellular fluid, and some of this current flows through the cellular membranes, modifying their charge and permeability, producing the self-propagating process called stimulation. In order to stimulate, it is necessary to reduce quickly the positive charge which normally exists on the surface of a resting cell until it reaches a critical point of local depolarization.
Okay. Now we're getting into his research, so it's going to get more interesting and more relevant. The book states that neurophysiological investigation has established correlations between mental phenomenon and psychochemical changes in the central nervous system and specific electrical responses of different areas of the brain can be identified following sensory stimulation of the eye with patterns, shapes, or movements. Advances in other scientific areas have proved that mental functions and human behavior can be modified by surgery, frontal lobotomy, by electronics, brain stimulation, and by chemistry, drug administration, thus placing the mind within the experimental reach. Ooh. This paragraph is about reaching the mind and eventually controlling it. Trying to control or manipulate someone's mind is nothing new. Persuasion is the most well-regarded and fair way to influence other people's minds, to influence a person's mind. However, persuasion is not a skill. It isn't, excuse me. However, persuasion is not only a skill, it is an art, and not a lot of people have that ability. Next is manipulation and deception, which is used by people who have no persuasion skills and low to no morals. I mean, I think if someone has persuasion skills, they're less likely to use manipulation and deception because, I think persuasion is probably like top notch, right? Once you get there, why would you even lower yourself to manipulation or deception? But so back to the manipulative and deceptive people. These disgusting types of people will call their manipulation and deceit, persuasion, and intelligence to make it sound better. There are also lazy people who don't have persuasion skills and don't feel like making a web of manipulation and deceit. These people these disgusting types will rush to a technological control of the mind, basically getting people to do what they want with the push of a button. Now, when I describe someone as disgusting, most of the times I'm referring to the members of the gang stalking network. I don't know if Delgado was a member of this network. He passed away in 2011, so I can't talk to him. Therefore, I will say that it appears that he was interested in offering an alternative to lobotomies and didn't seem to have a psychopathic desire to control other people's minds and bodies. With that said, if his research got into the wrong hands, then you could imagine what could happen, especially if that research has been advancing underground and covertly funded. Is that possible? Yes. Is that what happened? Has some research that has been publicly shut down been advancing privately or even in other countries with little or no bioethics or research ethic committees? Is that unheard of? Is it crazy to think that could have happened or that could be happening? I'll leave you to answer that for yourself. And I'll also add that a lot of drugs testing and administration, a lot of testing for new drugs and stuff can fall into the I'm trying to say it in a way. Okay, a lot of okay. So when a drug, so when okay, in the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm not in the pharmaceutical industry, but when there's a drug made, they usually like to give it to people to see the effects. Some companies, if they can't get the FDA and the other committees and other committees to allow them to experiment on those drugs or do research on the drugs to see how it affects human beings in the United States, they will take it somewhere else and they will run their tests to see if the drug is effective, and they can start selling the drug in other countries way before it reaches the US. And a lot of times that happens because the FDA or some committees and authorities in the US won't allow the drugs to come here until this and that has been done. And likewise, sometimes, researchers from other countries come here because pharmaceutical researchers come here because the US will allow some drug testing and research that their countries don't allow. So with that added information, I'll leave you to decide for yourself if that could have happened with Delgado's research. There is an article in which Delgado was quoted. It said, "But human nature," Delgado asserts, echoing one of the exhilarating and slightly scary themes of physical control, "is not static but dynamic, constantly changing as a result of our compulsive self-exploration." Can you avoid knowledge? Delgado asks. You cannot. Can you avoid technology? You cannot. There are things are going to go ahead in spite of ethics, in spite of your personal beliefs, in spite of everything. Delgado said that. And I'll leave that for you to make your own decision. All right. So, another part of the book, it says the working hypothesis may be summarized as follows. There are basic mechanisms in the brain responsible for all mental activities, including perception, emotions, abstract thoughts, social relations, and the most refined artistic creations. 2, the mechanisms may be detected, analyzed, influenced, and sometimes substituted for by means of physical and chemical technology. That's pretty much known. This approach does not claim that love or thoughts are exclusively neurophysiological phenomenon, but accepts the obvious fact that the central nervous system is absolutely necessary for any behavioral manifestation. It plans to study the mechanisms involved. 3, predictable behavior and mental responses may be induced by direct manipulation of the brain. 4, we can substitute intelligent and purposeful determination of neuronal functions for blind automatic responses. Ooh. Okay, the main thing in this paragraph is we can substitute intelligent and purposeful determination of neuronal functions for blind automatic responses. Okay. And then in another part, it says the development of new methodology to explore and communicate with the depth of the brain while the experimental subject engages in spontaneous or evoked activities now enables the scientist to analyze and control basic neurological mechanisms of the mind and represent a unique means of understanding the material and functional basis of individual structure. The future should see collaboration between those investigators who formerly studied neuronal physiology while disregarding behavior, and other scientists who have been interested in behavior while ignoring the brain. And that was on page 14. And the other, I think, was on page 13. Sorry, I didn't give you the pages. So experiments usually start as a researcher asking you to do something while they look at how your body or mind is responding. But the thing that makes this weird is that it says explore and communicate with depths of the brain while the experimental subject engages in spontaneous or evoked activities. Now enables the scientist to analyze and control basic neurological mechanisms of the mind. This is basically saying that the scientist is distracting your mind while they do things to manipulate and control your body. If you come back for random talk, I'll show you videos of Delgado's approach with mental health patients, where he asks them to do something, distract their mind, while he pushes a button to control their bodies and even their emotions. Another important thing to note is that a lot of Delgado's research is done on mentally ill patients. Is it a coincidence that there is an attempt to drive TIs crazy in order to control them? Is it that a sane, sound mind is harder to control or manipulate than a crazed mind? Even in a non-gang stalking situation with the textbook psychopaths and narcissists, you notice that the psychopath tries to make their victims think they are going crazy, like Mr. Mellon trying to make Mrs. Mellon think she was crazy. So is destabilizing the victim's mind the trick of the psychopathic trade? Back to TIs. Could all the street theater and petty arguments and drama be a way to distract your mind, the TI's mind, so that electronic harassment could be more effective? TIs, if you notice an increase in electronic harassment when you are mentally distracted or stressed out, please leave it in the comments. Whether on the replay, I don't really have a lot of people watching right now, whether on the replay or now, whatever you want to, if you want to. I'm not sure if this explains it, but it could be something to look into on whether all that BS that you have to watch and go through, is that just meant to distract you so that electronic harassment could be more effective. So what I'm thinking about, like, I watched a video of a TI showing how electronic harassment affects her. And she was just like, her head was nodding. It was interesting. And so I was wondering, if you come back and they just stressed you out while you were outside, and you come back into your home, and your home is they kind of like did stuff to your home to make it more feasible for them to electronic harass you, would you feel the electronic harassment more now that your mind is distracted with all the problems and issues and dramas? So I guess that's what I'm saying. So, have you noticed that your electronic harassment has been worse after they've kind of like escalated the psychological attacks on you and harassment in the streets and drama at work or whatever that they've conjured up, Has the electronic harassment been more, or has it affected you more? So that's what I'm asking. So back to this. The following is from a table on pages 14 and 15 of the PDF that I sent you. Well, of the PDF link that I put in the chat box on the YouTube page and the TalkShoe page. So, stimulation of the diencephalon in unanesthetized cats evoked well-organized motor effects and emotional reactions, implying that motor and emotional manifestations may be evoked by electrical stimulation of the brain in awake animals. So what this is saying is that they used cats that were awake and not medicated or under anesthesia, and they were able to use electrical stimulation to make the cats do and feel, okay, that's kind of scary, feel what they wanted. The diencephalon relays, and later on he's going to explain how he made a cat feel a certain way, because you're like, how did you make a cat feel a certain way? He's going to explain it. The diencephalon relays sensory information between brain regions and controls contains many autonomic functions of the peripheral nervous system. It connects structures of the endocrine system with the nervous system and works with the limbic system structures to generate and manage emotions and memories. This explains why they stimulated the diencephalon. And this is scary because they were able to control a cat's body and emotions by stimulating a part of its brain while it was awake and under no anesthesia. That was a breakthrough in Delgado's day, because what they used to do was put the animal under, and then they would just zap it with stuff and see if its body moves. But this cat was normal, awake, walking around, minding its business, and they were zapping it. Sounds familiar? So, in colonies of cats and monkeys, aggression, dominance, mounting, and other social interactions have been evoked, modified, or inhibited by radio stimulation of specific cerebral areas. implying that social behavior may be controlled by radio stimulation of specific areas of the brain. So they were basically able to control the animal's social behavior, including aggression, bullying, sexual attraction, and other interactions. They were able to start, stop, and change these things through radio stimulation. That's huge. Most of the references to radio frequency stimulation date back to the late 1960s. I don't know if that is because this is now outdated technology, but nonetheless, it seemed to have been in common use during the time of Delgado's research. In an issue of Science had an article called Radio Frequency Stimulation, a Research and Clinical Tool. And the record of the article states the radio frequency induction technique is now an important tool in physiological experiments and in the treatment of certain diseases. It has come to play an important role in the treatment of heart block in human patients where medication has been ineffective. In the case of bladder stimulation, work with animals has shown that the voiding of urine can be induced by electrical stimulation. The successful use of this technique on human patients has yet to be consistently achieved, but there is reason to be optimistic. So this is important because electronic harassment has been used to induce incontinence in TIs. In other words, these pathetic and disgusting people have tried to use this to make TIs urinate on themselves so that the TIs can be humiliated and experience mental distress. TIs, if this has happened to you, please don't comment right now. I will do a show on the health hazards of electronic harassment. It is too early to get into that right now without more solid proof of electronic harassment. So please hold on to comments on how electronic harassment has affected your digestive system until there's more solid proof to support your claims, or the beast might turn it around on you, make it into a joke, or make you look crazy. I just wanted to mention it here so some of the effects of electronic harassment could be known until it is proven. So, in the other parts of the book, it says autonomic and somatic functions, individual and social behavior, emotional and mental reactions may be evoked, maintained, modified, or inhibited, both in animals and in man, by electrical stimulation of specific cerebral structures. Physical control of many brain functions is a demonstrated fact, but the possibilities and limits of this control are still little known. And that's on page 15. And this statement confirms that many of the things TIs claim about electronic harassment are possible. So in another part, it says these accomplishments should familiarize us with the idea that we may also control the biological functions of living organisms from a distance. Cats, monkeys, or human beings can be induced to flex a limb, to reject food, or to feel emotional excitement under the influence of electrical impulses reaching the depths of their brains through radio waves purposely sent by an investigator. That's on page 16. This statement was made way back in the early 1970s by a scientist who spearheaded these experiments and wrote it in his book. In science, a hypothesis has to yield successful results that can be replicated by other scientists in order to be considered a scientific fact. This means that Delgado's experiments have been most likely replicated by other scientists and is now a scientific fact. Once this has happened, it can't be taken back. That knowledge is already out there for practically anyone to use. Let's be clear here. Way back in the early 1970s, a real scientist was able to use an electronic device to remotely control the mind, emotions, and bodies of not only animals, but also human beings. It is documented. So, when a TI has claims about electronic harassment, don't be so quick to dismiss it as crazy. Maybe someone should be looking into these claims. Maybe those someones should be a government department like the DOJ or the many other departments that are being paid by tax dollars to protect the US of A. We will now go on to the next 15 minutes.
Then, the ionic permeability of the membrane is modified, triggering a pre-established sequence of electrical and chemical phenomena. Excitation takes place in the vicinity of the negative electrode, or cathode, because the application of negative charges will neutralize the normally existing positivity at the external part of the cellular membrane. When stimulation is over, the positive polarity is reestablished on the membrane surface with the aid of energy provided by specific chemical reactions, and the cell is ready for a new stimulation. The relatively simple processes of depolarization and repolarization of cell membranes are the essential elements of neuronal excitation, and they are responsible for the extraordinary complexity of all behavioral performance. Our knowledge gap between understanding electrical events at the cellular level and deciphering the chain of phenomena taking place during the response of a whole organism is certainly formidable. How can we explain activities such as walking, problem solving, or ideation in terms of polarization and repolarization of membranes? Behavior certainly cannot occur without concomitant spike potentials and ionic exchanges. But the same statement holds true for oxygen and sugar consumption, and we must differentiate the mechanisms supporting basic, nonspecific cellular activities, such as metabolic requirements, from the mechanisms more specifically related to behavioral responses. Electrical activity of the neurons seems to have the dual role of indicating nonspecific activity and transmitting coded information. This ability to transmit coded information is the most important and least understood property of the nerve cell, and it represents the functional unit for nervous communication. In architecture, given a number of brick units, an infinite number of different houses can be constructed. We need to know both the properties of the individual bricks and the pattern of their organization in order to ascertain the properties and qualities of the final building. The characteristics of behavioral responses are determined by the combination of many depolarization phenomena, organized in space and repeated sequentially in time. Their arrangement is often so complex that it defies experimental analysis, and we must begin by examining very simple phenomena. The squid axon was for years a popular object of investigation in neurophysiology. Great caution should be observed, however, when applying experimental results with that preparation to the understanding of motor responses or mental activity. We should remember that knowledge of the letters of the alphabet will not explain the meaning of a phrase or reveal the beauty of a poem. In addition to investigating the spontaneous changes in membrane potentials, we can artificially depolarize membranes by electrical stimulation of cerebral neuronal pools in order to investigate their functional organization and behavioral consequences for the whole organism. Both of these experimental approaches should be used simultaneously in order to correlate cellular functions with behavioral results. Our present knowledge of the physiochemical basis of biological activity, which has an extensive bibliography, permits statement of the following principles. 1. All behavioral manifestations, including their mental aspects, require the existence of waves of negativity accompanied by electrical and chemical changes at the cellular level. 2. Membrane depolarization, artificially induced by electrical or chemical means, may be followed by observable behavioral manifestations. 3. While the complexity of these responses is extraordinary and many of their aspects are unknown, explanations of motor behavior and psychic activity do not require vital spirits or any other metaphysical principle because they are related to physical and chemical laws, which can be investigated experimentally. The classical experiments of Galvani, showing that the legs of a decapitated frog contract in response to electrical stimulation, are repeated many times every year in high school and college laboratories. These simple experiments demonstrate that a process of life, muscle contraction, can be elicited at the will of the investigator as many times as electricity is applied to the tissue. In the absence of stimulation, the legs do not contract. If the cells of the muscle are dead, Excitability and contractibility are lost, and the preparation does not respond. The contraction of the frog's legs is similar regardless of whether the muscle is stimulated directly through its motor nerve or through the brain, and this muscle action is also comparable to its activation during voluntary movements of the intact frog. The applied electricity does not create the limb movement, but acts only as a depolarizing agent, starting a chain of events which depends on the properties of the stimulated organ. The reliability and apparent simplicity of the muscle contraction may be misleading because, in reality, the contraction depends on tremendously complex processes, which include depolarization of the resting membrane, changes in its permeability, precipitous exchange of potassium, sodium, and other ions, creation of electrical fields, reorientation of proteic molecules within the muscle fiber with a shortening in the length of its chain, decomposition and synthesis of adenosine triphosphate, exchange of phosphoric acids, degradation of hexaphosphate into lactic acid, and many other enzymatic and biochemical reactions which follow each other according to a genetically determined plan within the muscle fiber and independent from the agent which initiates them. The mechanisms for contraction and relaxation of the muscle fiber are pre-established in the biological structure of the cells. Electricity, like the nervous system itself, acts as a trigger for these processes. This principle is fundamental for an understanding of the electrical control of biological functions. Organisms are composed of a large number of biological sequences, some of them inherited and others learned through experience. When a chain reaction has started, it proceeds according to an intrinsic plan which can be modified by feedback or by the arrival of new stimulations. In some cases, the trigger may be nonspecific, and, for example, muscular contraction can be initiated by mechanical, thermal, osmotic, chemical, electrical, or neuronal stimulation. In investigations of the brain as well as the muscle, electrical activation is preferable because it is not harmful for the cells and permits repeated studies of the same biological processes. By applying electricity, we can activate pre-established functional mechanisms of a structure and discover its possible role in spontaneous behavior. By means of ESB, or electrical stimulation of the brain, it is possible to control a variety of functions: a movement, a glandular secretion, or a specific mental manifestation, depending on the chosen target. Necessary methodology and examples of selected results are discussed in the following chapters. Chapter 11. Methodology for direct communication with the brain. The depth of the central nervous system can be reached very easily through the natural windows of sensory receptors. Stimuli, such as patterns of light, travel fast from the eye's retina through optic pathways to the visual cortex located in the occipital lobe. Would it be possible to explore the local activity of cortical neurons during the process of symbolic perception? Could we evoke similar sensations by direct stimulation of specific neurons? Can we reach the mind of an individual without using the normal ports of sensory entry? Can we direct the functions of the brain artificially? These and similar problems have attracted the interest of many investigators, but the brain is well protected by layers of membranes, spinal fluid, bone, and teguments, a formidable shield which for a long time has kept the secrets of mental functions away from scientific curiosity. Implantation of electrodes in animals. Starting in the last century, many investigators have explored the brain, first in animals and recently in human patients as part of diagnosis and therapy. In these studies, it was necessary to open both skin and skull, and because the procedure was painful, it was mandatory to use anesthesia. It blocked pain perception, but it also inhibited some of the most important functions of the nervous system. Emotions, consciousness, and free behavior were certainly absent under heavy sedation, and for many years scientists directed their attention to sleeping subjects and overlooked the complexity of awake brains. Textbooks of cerebral physiology were concerned with pathways, connections, reflexes, posture, and movement. Mental functions and behavior were considered to belong to a different discipline. The methodological breakthrough which made it possible to study the brain of behaving animals came in the 1930s, when W.R. Hess devised a procedure to implant very fine wires within the brain of anesthetized cats. After the effects of anesthesia had disappeared, the relatively free and normal animal could be electrically stimulated by connecting long leads to the terminals of the implanted electrodes. This procedure was refined in the early 1950s by reducing the size of the electrodes while increasing the number of intracerebral contacts and using aseptic precautions during implantation. Surgical accuracy in reaching chosen cerebral targets was also improved by means of micromanipulators and a precise system of anatomical coordinates, which made it possible to reach similar structures in different subjects. Using biologically inert materials such as gold, platinum, or stainless steel wires insulated with Teflon allows the electrodes to be left inside of the brain indefinitely. A diagram of the cerebral implantation shows that through a small opening in the skull, the shaft is introduced down to a predetermined depth and is secured with dental cement at the point where it passes through the skull. Then the upper portion of the shaft is bent over the bone surface and secured again a short distance away, and the terminal socket is exteriorized on the head. Each contact of the brain corresponds to a determined point in the depth of the brain, which is accessible merely by plugging in a connector, a procedure as simple as connecting any electrical appliance to a wall outlet. This technique has been used for ESB in thousands of animals, in many laboratories around the world, and there is ample experience of its efficiency, accuracy, and safety, resolving the initial skepticism that introduction of wires into the brain would be technically difficult, dangerous for the subject, and grossly disruptive of normal functions. It is true that implantation of electrodes destroys neurons along the path of penetration, breaking capillary vessels and later producing a local reaction involving the formation of a thin fibrotic capsule along the implantation tract. It has been proven, however, that local hemorrhage is negligible, and that because of the well-known functional redundancy of neural tissue with abundance of duplication in its circuits, the destruction of a relatively small group of neurons does not produce any detectable deficit. The thin reactive encapsulation is electrically conductive and is not an obstacle to stimulation or recording. Beyond this 1/10 to 2/10 of a millimeter capsule, the brain appears histologically normal. Judged by the absence of abnormal electrical activity, the reliability of effects evoked by ESB, and the consistency of thresholds of excitability through months of experimentation, the electrodes seem to be well tolerated. Some of our monkeys have had electrodes in their heads for more than 4 years. The anchorage is very solid, and after some initial pulling and scratching of the terminal sockets, the monkeys seem to ignore their presence. As many as 100 contacts have been implanted in the brain of some chimpanzees without any noticeable neurophysiological or behavioral disturbance. And in several monkeys, contacts have been placed in areas as critical and delicate as the respiratory centers of the medulla without any surgical problems. Electrodes have also been used in laboratory animals such as rats, cats, and monkeys, and also in less frequently studied species, including crickets, roosters, dolphins, and brave bulls. Electrodes in the human brain. Our present knowledge of the central nervous system is based principally on investigations in animals. Experience has shown that many questions about implantation in humans, such as biological tolerance of electrodes by the neural tissue, can be successfully answered in cats or in lower species. Some of the electrochemical events of neuronal conduction can be analyzed just as adequately in squids as in mammals, and for certain studies of memory, the octopus has proven an excellent subject. The rat has been, and still is, the animal preferred by experimental psychologists because it is a small and inexpensive mammal, which can be used in large quantities to provide behavioral
Ooh,
for statistical
sorry.
evaluation. The limited behavioral repertoire of lower animals, however, cannot be compared with the complex activity of monkeys and apes. These species, being closer relatives of man, are more appropriate subjects for the neurophysiological study of intelligent behavior. And when we want to investigate the highest psychological functions of the brain, which involve verbal communication, there is no possible substitute for man himself.
Creepy. The part that I accidentally turned muted, he was just saying how he likes to experiment on rats. All right. So, but you can read it in the PDF I sent you. All right. So let's go through that. Almost 15 minutes. Less. It was whatever. Anyway, it says the contraction of the frog's legs is similar regardless of whether the muscle is stimulated directly through its motor nerve or through the brain, and this muscle action is also comparable to its activation during voluntary movements in the intact frog. The applied electricity does not create the limb movement, but acts as a depolarizing agent, starting a chain of events which depend on the properties of the stimulated organ. And that's on page 18 of the PDF I sent you. So this is good news for TIs. And now he's getting into his research now. This is the action. We're in the action part, okay? This is good news for TIs because what this paragraph is saying is that it isn't necessary to control the entire function. To move the frog's leg, the electricity is not performing the function as the body would by going through every step. All it does is provide a stimulus to start a domino effect to achieve the limb movement. Okay, picture this. You have a row of dominoes standing up back to back, right? You're at one end and the last domino is all the way at the other end. And all you want to do is cause that last domino to move or fall down. You are the electricity or the stimulus that the scientists would use. If this was a limb, if this was a limb, the body will go through a complicated chain of events to move the limb or the last domino. However, all you have to do is provide a stimulus in the right spot. All you have to do is tap the domino nearest to you, and it starts a chain of events so that the last domino will fall. You don't even have to touch it. If you blow on it hard enough, the domino nearest to you will fall and make the other dominoes fall over until it reaches the last one. Does that make sense? So the stimulus in electronic harassment has not completely taken over your body if you are a TI who's experiencing electronic harassment. And it has not completely taken over your mind. It just starts a chain of events that could possibly be stopped if you're not distracted or freaking out because you feel as if you're under mind control. There are times when you should freak out, but sometimes staying calm and having an idea of what is going on may help you stop the domino effect of the electronic harassment stimulus. So so another part of the book goes, the mechanism for contraction and relaxation in the muscle fiber are pre-established in the biological structure of the cells. Electricity, like the nervous system itself, acts as a trigger for these processes. What does that mean? This scientist has learned how to target the reflexes and electronically stimulate the reflexes in a way to create complex actions other than the familiar knee jerk. The knee jerk was you go to the doctor, he hits a certain part of your knee pops up. Even if you don't have to do anything, it just happens because he hit your knee. All right. So this scientist has learned how to do more than that. He's learned how to tap something and you get up and walk or something like that. So, it's more than a knee jerk. So it could be that electronic harassment is also causing a reflex reaction similar to what this scientist has done. And then in another part, it says, in investigations of the brain as well as the muscle, electrical activation is preferable because it is not harmful for the cells and permits repeated studies of the same biological processes. By applying electricity, we can activate pre-established functional mechanisms of a structure and discover its possible role in spontaneous behavior by means of electrical stimulation of the brain. he refers to it later as ESP. You're gonna hear ESP a lot, and that just means electrical stimulation of the brain. It is possible, he goes on to say, it is possible to control a variety of functions, a movement, a glandular secretion, or a specific mental manifestation depending on the chosen target. And that's on page 18. The science that Delgado is talking about is being used today in beauty treatments, medical procedures, and other common things. It is used to treat some psychiatric conditions. There are also those are some of its beneficial and acceptable uses. So you can't say that his science has disappeared completely. For people that wanted to lose weight, there was a device that was made to zap you with electricity when you wanted to overeat. And then it kind of like quelled your appetite. I couldn't find that video, so I couldn't show it to you. But I remember that. But I did find a video of a Pavlov bracelet that you can use to stop behaviors that you don't want. You can even allow people to remotely shock you. So while this is Pavlov's idea, that's a different scientist. Excuse me, while this is Pavlov's discovery and not Delgado's, it all follows the same types of science. I'm just trying to point out that the findings of Delgado's research is still being applied today in different forms. So it still exists and can be used in a bad way if it got into the wrong hands. With that, let's go through the next 15 minutes.
The human brain, like any other part of the body, may suffer traumatic accidents, tumors, or illnesses, and it has often been necessary to explore the affected areas in order to identify structures, assess abnormality of the tissues, test excitability, and learn the location of important functions which should not be disrupted during surgical procedures. Conscious participation of the patient was required in some of these explorations. For example, to ascertain whether the aura of epileptic attacks could be triggered by electrical stimulation of a specific cortical point, thus providing information about the possible source of epileptic discharges which could be removed by surgery. For this kind of investigation, the brain was exposed under local anesthesia, presenting an exceptional opportunity to study behavioral and psychological responses evoked by ESP in fully awake subjects. The most extensive work in this area has been carried out by Penfield and his associates in Montreal, and a considerable number of similar studies have been performed by other neurosurgeons as well. Exploration of the exposed brain has, however, some obvious limitations. It has to be brief in order to provide prolongation of surgery. Electrodes are usually held in place by hand, causing variability in the applied mechanical pressure. The exposed brain is subject to possible thermal, mechanical, and chemical trauma. The cortical areas are identified only by visual inspection, and the physical and psychological stress of the patient undergoing operation introduces factors difficult to control. Most of these handicaps can be avoided with the use of implanted electrodes, and given the experience of animal experimentation, it was natural that some investigators should contemplate the application of this methodology to patients for diagnostic and therapeutic purposes. Neurosurgeons had already proved that the central nervous system is not as delicate as most people believe, and during therapeutic surgery, parts of the cerebral tissue have been cut, frozen, cauterized, or ablated with negligible adverse effects on the patients. Exploratory introduction of needles into the cerebral ventricles is a well-known and relatively safe clinical procedure. And since electrodes are smaller in diameter than these needles, their introduction into the brain should be even less traumatic. Experience has confirmed the safety and usefulness of long-term implantation of electrodes in man, and the procedure has been used in specialized medical centers around the world to help thousands of patients suffering from epilepsy, involuntary movements, intractable pain, anxiety neurosis, and other cerebral disturbances. In general, several assemblies of fine electrodes with a total of 20 to 40 contacts are placed on the surface and/or in the depth of the brain, with the terminal connectors exteriorized through the scalp and protected by a small head bandage. In some cases, the electrodes have remained for nearly 2 years with excellent tolerance. Leaving wires inside of a thinking brain may appear unpleasant or dangerous. But actually, the many patients who have undergone this experience have not been concerned about the fact of being wired, nor have they felt any discomfort due to the presence of conductors in their heads. Some women have shown their feminine adaptability to circumstances by wearing attractive hats or wigs to conceal their electrical headgear, and many people have been able to enjoy a normal life as outpatients, returning to the clinic periodically for examination and stimulation. In a few cases in which contacts were located in pleasurable areas, patients have had the opportunity to stimulate their own brains by pressing the button of a portable instrument, and this procedure is reported to have therapeutic benefits. Chronically implanted electrodes enable careful diagnostic explorations to be performed without time limit, and repeated electrical excitations or well-controlled coagulations can be graded according to the reactions of the patient. As a bonus, important information about psychophysiological correlations, providing direct knowledge about the cerebral basis of human behavior, is being acquired. In our studies, an interview situation was selected as the method most likely to offer a continuous supply of verbal and behavioral data. While the electrical activity of 8 pairs of cerebral points was being recorded, we taped about 1 hour of conversation between therapist and patient. Notes of the observable behavior were also taken. During the interview, electrical stimulations of the brain were applied for 5 seconds, with intervals of 3 or more minutes, and each significant point was explored several times. Electronic technology has reached a high level of sophistication, and two-way radio communication with automobiles, airplanes, and outer space vehicles is commonplace today. The notable lag in development of similar instrumentation for communication with the depth of the brain reflects the already mentioned unbalanced evolution of our technological civilization, which seems more interested in accumulating power than in understanding and influencing the basic mechanisms of the human mind. This gap is now being filled. It is already possible to equip animals or human beings with minute instruments called stimulatives for radio transmission and reception of electrical messages to and from the brain in completely unrestrained subject. Microminiaturization of the instrument's electronic components permits control of all parameters of excitation for radio stimulation of 3 different points within the brain, and also telemetric recording of 3 channels of intracerebral electrical activity. In animals, the stimulaceiver may be anchored to the skull, and different members of a colony can be studied without disturbing their spontaneous relations within a group. Behavior, such as aggression, can be evoked or inhibited. In patients, the stimulaceiver may be strapped to the head bandage, permitting electrical stimulation and monitoring of intracerebral activity without disturbing spontaneous activities. Stimulatives offer great promise in the investigation, diagnosis, and therapy of cerebral disturbances in man. Preliminary information about use in patients with temporal lobe seizures has demonstrated the following advantages over other methods of intracerebral exploration. 1. The patient is instrumented simply by plugging the stimulaceiver to the head sockets. 2. There is no disturbance of the spontaneous individual or social behavior of the patient. 3. The subject is under continuous medical supervision, and stimulations and recordings may be made day and night. 4. Studies are carried out during spontaneous social interactions in the hospital environment, without introducing factors of anxiety or stress. 5. The brain in severely disturbed patients may be explored without confinement to a recording room. 6. As connecting wires are not necessary, there is no risk of dislodgement of electrodes during abnormal behavior. 7. Therapeutic programmed stimulation of the brain could be prolonged for any necessary amount of time. It is reasonable to speculate that in the near future, the stimulaceiver may provide the essential link from man to computer to man, with a reciprocal feedback between neurons on instruments which represents a new orientation for the medical control of neurophysiological functions. For example, it is conceivable that the localized abnormal electrical activity which announces the imminence of an epileptic attack could be picked up by implanted electrodes, telemetered to a distant instrument room, tape recorded, and analyzed by a computer capable of recognizing abnormal electrical patterns. Identification of the specific electrical disturbance could trigger the emission of radio signals to activate the patient's stimuloceiver and apply an electrical stimulation to a determined inhibitory area of the brain, thus blocking the onset of the convulsive episode. This speculation is supported by the following experiments completed in June 1969, in collaboration with Doctors Johnston, Wallace, and Bradley. Chimpanzee Patty, while free in her cage, was equipped with a stimuloceiver to telemeter the brain activity of her right and left amygdaloid nuclei to an adjacent room, where these waves were received, tape recorded, and automatically analyzed by an online analog computer. This instrument was instructed to recognize a specific pattern of waves, a burst of spindles, which was normally present in both amygdaloid nuclei for about 1 second several times per minute. The computer was also instructed to activate a stimulator, and each time the spindles appeared, radio signals were sent back to Patty's brain to stimulate a point in her reticular formation known to have negative reinforcing properties. In this way, electrical stimulation of one cerebral structure was contingent on the production of a specific EEG pattern by another area of the brain, and the whole process of identification of information and command of action was decided by the online computer. Results showed that about 2 hours after the brain-to-computer-to-brain feedback was established, spindling activity of the amygdaloid nucleus was reduced to 50%. And 6 days later, with daily 2-hour periods of feedback, spindles were drastically reduced to only 1% of normal occurrence. And the chimpanzee was quieter, less attentive, and less motivated during behavioral testing, although able to perform olfactory and visual tasks without errors. The computer was then disconnected, and 2 weeks later, the EEG and Patty's behavior returned to normal. The experiment was repeated several times with similar results, supporting the conclusions that direct communication can be established between brain and computer, circumventing normal sensory organs, and also that automatic learning is possible by feeding signals directly into specific neuronal structures without conscious participation. One of the limiting factors in these studies was the existence of wires leading from the brain to the stimuloceiver outside of the scalp. The wires represented a possible portal of entry for infection and could be a hindrance to hair grooming in spite of their small size. It would obviously be far more desirable to employ minute instruments which could be implanted completely beneath the skin. For this purpose, we have developed in our laboratory a small 3-channel stimulator which can be placed subcutaneously and which has terminal leads to be implanted within the brain. The instrument is solid state, has no batteries, and can work indefinitely. Necessary electrical energy, remote control of parameters of stimulation, and choice of channels are provided by transdermal coupling, using a small coil which is activated by frequency-modulated radio signals. In February 1969, an experiment was begun in monkey Nona and in chimpanzee Susie, who were equipped with subcutaneous stimulators to activate their brains from time to time for the rest of their lives. Terminal contacts were located in motor pathways in order to evoke flexion of the contralateral leg, an effect simple enough to be observed and quantified without difficulty. Study of Nona and Susie and preliminary investigations in other animals have demonstrated that subcutaneous instrumentation is efficient, reliable, and well tolerated. Behavioral responses were consistent, and local motor excitability was not modified by repeated experimentation. Thus, the technical problems of stimulating any desired area of the brain for as long as necessary, in the absence of conductors passing through the skin, have been solved. Therapeutic and scientific possibilities have been multiplied, and the comfort of subjects has been considerably increased. The next technical step will be to combine transdermal stimulation of the brain with transdermal telemetry of EEG. In this case, the stimuloceiver will not be outside the skin as it was in Patty, nor will it be limited to only transdermal stimulation, as in Nona and Susie. The whole instrument will be totally subcutaneous. The technology for non-sensory communication between brains and computers through the intact skin is already at our fingertips,
Hmm.
and its consequences are difficult to predict. In the past, the progress of civilization has tremendously magnified the power of our senses, muscles, and skills. Now, we are adding a new dimension: the direct interface between brains and machines. Although true, this statement is perhaps too spectacular and it requires cautious clarification. Our present knowledge regarding the coding of information, mechanisms of perception, and neuronal bases of behavior is so elemental that it is highly improbable that electrical correlates of thoughts or emotions could be picked up, transmitted, and electrically applied to the suitable structure of a different subject in order to be recognized and to trigger related thoughts or emotions. It is, however, already possible to induce a large variety of responses, from motor effects to emotional reactions and intellectual manifestations, by direct electrical stimulation of the brain. Also, several investigators have learned to identify patterns of electrical activity, which a computer could also recognize, located in specific areas of the brain and related to determined phenomena such as perception of smells or visual perception of edges and movements. We are advancing rapidly in the pattern recognition of electrical correlates of behavior and in the methodology for two-way radio communication between brain and computers. Fears have been expressed that this new technology brings with it the threat of possible unwanted and unethical remote control of the cerebral activities of man by other men. But as will be discussed later, this danger is quite improbable and is outweighed by the expected clinical and scientific benefits. Electronic knowledge and microminiaturization have progressed so much that the limits appear biological rather than technological. Our greatest need is for more experimental information about the neuronal mechanisms related to behavioral and mental processes, and research in unrestricted subjects promises to reveal new understanding of normal minds and more efficient therapy of disturbed brains.
Okay. So, let's go through that 15 minutes. So it says experience has confirmed the safety and usefulness of long-term implantations. Yeah. Experience has confirmed the safety and usefulness of long-term implantations of electrodes in man, and the procedure has been used in specialized medical centers around the world to help thousands of patients suffering from epilepsy, involuntary movements, intractable pain, anxiety, neurosis, and other cerebral disturbances. And that's on page 13 of the PDF that I gave the link to. And this just states that the implantation of electrodes was common and acceptable during the time of Delgado's research, and it also lists the common applications. And I thought that was important because as you can see from what I said before about electroceuticals, things are coming full circle. Yeah, and there's a reason for that. I'll give you a brief background on Delgado's research. And you're going to know a lot about Delgado after this 3-week session. But let me give you a brief background. His experiment was shut down. When people found out what he did experiment on humans. And back in those days, I guess that was okay. It's not like it is now. And people were like, people didn't like his research, so they shut him down. And it was legitimate. He was a Yale professor. He studied at Yale. His research took place at Yale and everything, and it was acceptable in his time. But after he got these results and stuff, he went out and he started telling people about what he did, and there was like a public outroar. And his research was shut down, and now it's kind of like coming back. So that's why I wanted to read that sentence, because you're going to see that. I guess, anyway, you know what? I just want you to know that this research has been done before, and you're going to see that research come back, and it's going to apply to healing, certain ailments and all that stuff. But you will know, because you read this book and in this book club, that all this has been done before and where it's coming from and where it could possibly lead if the technology I think it already fell into the wrong hands. But if it falls further into the well, it already fell into the wrong hands. So you know what I mean? If the public realizes it fell into the wrong hands. All right. So the next thing it says is it is reasonable to speculate that in the near future, the stim receiver may provide the essential link from man to computer to man with the a reciprocal feedback between neurons and instruments, which represents a new orientation for the medical control of neurophysiological functions. For example, it is conceivable that the localized abnormal electrical activity, which announces the imminence of an epileptic attack, could be picked up by implantable electrodes, telemetered to a distant instrument room, tape recorded, and analyzed by a computer capable of recognizing abnormal electrical patterns and capable of recognizing abnormal electrical patterns. Identification of specific electrical disturbance could trigger the emission of radio signals to activate the patient's stim receiver and apply an electrical stimulation to a determined inhibitory area of the brain, thus blocking the onset of the convulsive episode. And that's on page 26. And I don't know where I read it, but I read that something like this is being used or developed now. Either way, it sounds a bit like electroceuticals. And like I said before, like just reading that, if you understood what it said, I know it could be complicated to understand if you're not like into science and stuff. Don't feel like you're stupid. You're not stupid. It's just that not a lot of people are into science or could understand that just by reading at face value, or reading it one time. Sometimes it takes several times, and sometimes it takes Googling certain things before you understand it, and that's fine. That's what's called learning. But even reading that, I could just see that as like an advertisement for a new for electroceuticals or a new uh, electrical device. I mean, think about it. I could see commercials like, "Oh my God, so you think you're getting a pimple? We have a device that could, you know, sense the onset of a pimple, and it'll send electrical, like, could you imagine like a cosmetics company giving you a device you put it on your skin or your body somewhere, and then it could sense pimples. It could sense that your body's about to create a pimple at their lab, and then all they do is just like zap you, and then it hits the pimple, and then that pimple never comes up. Like, I can see that totally happening, and I can see people like saying, "Oh my God, that's so cool. This is so advanced." And I can see like it selling. I can see people like putting this device on themselves, and so that they don't have any pimples, because the cosmetic company has a bunch of computers that's going to detect that you're getting a pimple and zap your skin so that that pimple never develops. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I could definitely see that. So that's like when I read that, I'm like, oh my, I could see it coming back. And like I said, I don't want to like vilify Delgado's research. He was more interested, I think, I don't know, in preventing lobotomies, because lobotomies are brutal and they shouldn't have been done. So he was just offering an alternative to lobotomies. That, from what I've read about him, was his motivation. He wasn't trying to take over the world or have mind control or anything like that. I can't wait. Okay, I gotta wait to the third part when I catch you up on when I give you more information on his background and what happened to him and his research and everything like that. All right, and then you can. Okay, so I'm not gonna spoil it for you. No spoilers. So yeah, so let's leave it like that. So you can see this coming back around, and as a POI and a TI, you can see the general public just accepting this, but because you're a TI and you know the bad part of this how this technology can be used badly, it's like this is what blows my mind, because I was like, oh my gosh, people are gonna like put these devices on themselves, and then like if a psychopath wanted to take over, they could just take over these devices and do what they want to do. And that's why I think it's important to invest for investigations to be done on the TI's claims, because I think TIs have valuable information on these new technologies that are coming up, and TIs can offer insight into that slippery slope, into what could happen if this worst case scenario, because the worst case scenario, I feel like on some level is being tested out right now on a small group of people. And it's just so important. I mean, not ramble, I can ramble on about this. So anyway, so I just wanted to point that out. And then the next part, it says, it would obviously be far more desirable to employ minute instruments which could be implanted completely beneath the skin. For this purpose, we have developed in our laboratory a small 3-channel stimulator which can be placed subcutaneously and which has terminal leads to be implanted within the brain. And then later on, it says, an experiment was begun in monkey Nona and in chimpanzee Susie, who were equipped with subcutaneous stimulators to activate their brains from time to time for the rest of their lives. Terminal contacts were located in motor pathways in order to evoke flexion of the contralateral leg. An effect simple enough to be observed and quantified without difficulty. And then later on it says, thus the technical problem of stimulating any desired area of the brain for as long as necessary in the absence of conductors passing through the skin has been solved. Therapeutic and scientific possibilities have been multiplied and the comfort of subjects has been considerably increased. And that's on page 27. Delgado also, I think, he really is a pioneer. His research just scared a whole bunch of people, so he didn't get the recognition that he would have gotten had his research not scared a whole bunch of people. But he developed a device that was able to give doses of medication just by being implanted. And then, like, I was just thinking while I was reading this, isn't that like that birth control thing that they have, the Nova Ring or something? You just implant it under your skin, and it doses you. And it doses, if you're a female, it doses you with it gives you doses of birth control. You don't have to do anything. I mean, like, this is just bizarre. But yeah, he thought of that. I think he was doing that way back in the 1960s. So, and then look, we have it, now. So that's just to piggyback on what I said before. So anyway, back to what I just read. The chimps were mind controlled their whole life. And they were basically unaware of it because the implants were undetectable and it caused little to no comfort. So what I just read, what it basically said was, and I think that was pretty self-explanatory. Did they chip them? I think they chipped a bunch of monkeys. They chipped 2 monkeys, and all they wanted to do, they wanted to see how long they could keep the chips in the monkey's head and control their limb movement. And the thing that they chose was like, okay, we're gonna make this monkey lift their leg for the rest of their life on, when we tell them to. And it worked. They chipped the monkeys, and for the rest of those monkeys' lives, they were walking around minding their business and their leg would just lift. It's ridiculous. But it worked and he achieved his goal. And they probably didn't think anything of it. They're probably like, oh, I have this weird habit. Well, monkeys can't talk, but if monkeys talk, if monkey could talk, they were just like, every once in a while my legs just lifts. I don't know. It's just a kink in my mind or anything. Little they know, somebody was causing that. Anyway, so not that the monkeys were worried, I'm sure. Well, they probably were, and I don't know, whatever. So fears have been expressed. It goes on to say, fears have been expressed that this new technology bring with it the threat of possible unwanted and unethical remote control of cerebral activities of men by other men. Really? But as will be discussed later, this danger is quite improbable and is outweighed by the expected clinical and scientific benefits. If you say so, right? On page 29, I can't wait to find out how he explains away the threat of possible unwanted and unethical remote control of the cerebral activities of a man by other men. Stay tuned for that one. All right, so with that, let's go on to the next 15 minutes. And we're probably going to go over 3 hours.
Chapter 12. Electrical Stimulation of the Brain, ESB. The master control for the whole body resides in the brain, and the new methodology of implanted electrodes has provided direct access to the centers which regulate most of the body's activities. The brain also constitutes the material substratum of mental functions, and by exploring its working neurons, we have the possibility of investigating experimentally some of the classical problems of mind-brain correlations. In addition to new answers, implantation of electrodes has introduced new problems. Is it feasible to induce a robot-like performance in animals and men by pushing the buttons of a cerebral radio stimulator? Could drives, desires, and thoughts be placed under the artificial command of electronics? Can personality be influenced by ESP? Can the mind be physically controlled? In scientific literature, there is already a substantial amount of information demonstrating the remarkable effects induced by ESP. The heart, for instance, can be stopped for a few beats, slowed down, or accelerated by suitable stimulation of determined cortical and subcortical structures, illustrating the physiological reality that it is the brain which controls the heart and not vice versa. Respiratory rate and amplitude have been driven by ESP. Gastric secretion and motility have also been modified by brain stimulation. The diameter of the pupil can be adjusted at will from maximum constriction to maximum dilation, as if it were a photographic camera, simply by changing the intensity knob of an electric stimulator connected with the hypothalamic region of the brain. Most visceral functions have been influenced by ESP, as have sensory perceptions, motor activities, and mental functions. Rather than examine each type of finding in detail, we have selected a few examples to illustrate the main aspects of electrical control of the brain and its behavioral consequences. Chapter 13. Motor Responses. Behavior is the result of motor activities which range from a simple muscular twitch to the creation of a work of art. If we consider the skill involved in nest building, the strategies of fighting animals, or the precision of piano playing, it is obvious that these activities are not solely the result of physical and chemical processes of muscular contraction, but depend on conscious direction, or on the refined complexity of their cerebral command. Very little is known about the automatic aspects of voluntary acts, how purpose is related to performance, or how contractions are organized in time and space. Present methodology, however, has placed some of these questions within experimental reach. The fact that ESP can induce simple movements was discovered in the 19th century, and today we know that the cerebral organization of motility is located mainly in the cortex of the parietal lobe. Stimulation of this area induces movements on the opposite side of the body, while its destruction results in paralysis. These findings have been expressed in attractive diagrams showing the motor areas of the brain as an homunculus lying upside down in the parietal cortex, with a big face and a big thumb, like a caricature of a little man in charge of motility. This image was partly responsible for consideration of the cortex as the supreme and intelligent organizer of behavior. However, further research demonstrated that motor responses obtained from this cortex are rather crude, and that other areas in the depth of the brain have a decisive role in the organization of skilled motility. Modern concepts suggest that the cortex should not be considered the highest hierarchical structure of the motor system, or even the starting point of motor impulses, but rather a way station, one more link in the loops of sensory motor correlations. The multiplicity and complexity of motor representation is logical when we consider the tremendous variety of behavioral manifestations, which constitute the only means of communication between the individual and his surroundings. This relation requires a motor performance with precise temporal and spatial coordination among many functional units, and the processing of a great deal of information for the adjustment and guidance of movements, and for instantaneous adaptation to changes in circumstances. Because of the complexity of these mechanisms, it has been assumed that the artificial ESP could never induce refined and purposeful motor performance. The surprising fact is that, depending on its location, electrical stimulation of the brain is able to evoke not only simple responses, but also complex and well-organized behavior, which may be indistinguishable from spontaneous activity. Motor activation in animals. A classical experiment for medical students is to anesthetize a rabbit or other small mammal and to expose its brain in order to stimulate the motor cortex. In this way, simple responses, such as contraction or extension of the limbs, may be demonstrated. These responses usually involve a small group of muscles, are stereotyped, and lack adaptability. But in spite of these limitations, students are generally impressed by seeing the movements of an animal placed under the command of a human being. The demonstration is far more elegant if the experimental animal is completely awake and equipped with electrodes implanted in the brain. Then the responses appear more physiological, and we can investigate the mutual influence of spontaneous and evoked motility. Electrical stimulation of the right side motor cortex of a cat may produce flexion of the left hind leg with an amplitude of movement proportional to the applied intensity. For example, in one experiment, when the animal was standing on all fours, the intensity of 1.2 milliamperes evoked flexion of the leg barely off the ground. At 1.5 milliamperes, the hind leg rose about 4 centimeters. And when 1.8 milliamperes were applied, leg flexion was complete. The evoked movement began slowly, developed smoothly, reached its peak in about 2 seconds, and lasted until the end of the stimulation. This motor performance could be repeated as many times as desired, and it was accompanied by a postural adjustment of the whole body, which included lowering of the head, raising of the pelvis, and a slight weight shift to the left in order to maintain equilibrium on only 3 legs. The electrical stimulation did not produce any emotional disturbance, and the cat was as alert and friendly as usual, rubbing its head against the experimenter, seeking to be petted and purring. If, however, we tried to prevent the evoked effect by holding the left hind leg with our hands, the cat stopped purring, struggled to get free, and shook its leg. Apparently, the evoked motility was not unpleasant, but attempts to prevent it were disturbing for the animal, suggesting that stimulation produced not a blind motor movement, but also a desire to move, and the cat cooperated spontaneously with the electrical command, adjusting its posture before performing the leg flexion. It was evident that the animal was not in a hurry and took its time in preparing for the induced movement. Preliminary adjustments were not seen if the cat's posture was already adequate for the leg flexion. In cases of conflict between the spontaneous movements of the animal and those elicited by the experimenter, the final result depended on the relative strength of the opposing signals. For example, if the cat was walking, threshold stimulations of 1.2 milliamperes for slight leg flexion were ineffective. If the cat was stimulated while jumping off a table to reach food, stronger intensities of up to 1.5 milliamperes, which usually evoked a clear motor response, were also ineffective. Physiological activity seemed to override the artificial excitation, and the cat landed with perfectly coordinated movements. If the intensity was increased to 2 milliamperes, stimulation effects were prepotent over voluntary activities. Leg flexion started during the jump, coordination was disrupted, and the cat landed badly. In monkeys, electrical stimulation of motor areas has evoked contralateral movements similar to those described for the cat. The stimulated animal showed no signs of fear or hostility, nor did he interrupt his spontaneous behavior, such as walking, climbing, or eating. Evoked and spontaneous movements influenced each other, and the final result was a combination of both. Simultaneous stimulation of 2 cerebral points with opposite effects could establish a dynamic balance without any visible effect. For example, if excitation of one point produced turning of the head to the right, and another one produced turning of the head to the left, the monkey did not move his head at all when both points were stimulated. This equilibrium could be maintained at different intensity levels of simultaneous stimulation. Brain stimulation of different areas has elicited most of the simple movements observed in spontaneous behavior, including frowning, opening and closing of the eyes, opening, closing, and deviation of the mouth, movements of the tongue, chewing, contraction of the face, movements of the ears, turns, twists, flexions, and extensions of the head and body, and movements of the arms, legs, and fingers. We must conclude that most, if not all, of the possible simple movements can be evoked by electrical stimulation of the brain. Abnormal responses, disorganized movements, loss of equilibrium, and epileptic form convulsions have also been produced, depending on the cerebral area and parameters of stimulation investigated. Turning now to more complex responses, we must realize that normal activities in animals and man involve a succession of different acts well coordinated in space and in time. Walking, for example, is a displacement of the body with alternate flexion and extension of the extremities requiring refined control of strength, amplitude, and speed, with a contraction of different groups of muscles with precise timing and mutual correlation aimed toward a common goal. In addition, postural adaptation and corrective movements of the head and body are necessary. To induce walking in an animal by programmed electrical stimulation of individual muscles would be a formidable task, requiring the wiring of perhaps 100 muscles, the use of a complex computer, sophisticated timing mechanisms, large numbers of stimulators with instantaneously adjustable intensities, many sensors, and the help of a team of scientists and technicians, in addition to a cooperative animal and a measure of good luck. The surprising fact is that electrical pulses applied directly to the brain activate cerebral structures which possess the necessary functional complexity to induce walking with apparently normal characteristics. In one of our experiments, monkey Kuru was sitting in the colony cage picking some food when radio stimulation of his thalamus, located in the center of the brain, began. The animal slowly got up and started walking around the cage on all fours at a speed of about 1 meter per second, without bumping against the walls or against other animals, in a normal manner, without any signs of anxiety, fear, or discomfort. At the end of 5 to 10 seconds of stimulation, the monkey calmly sat down and resumed picking food. As soon as stimulation was reapplied, Kuru resumed walking around the cage. In some studies, this effect was repeated as often as 60 times in 1 hour. The speed and pattern of a motor response vary according to the cerebral structure stimulated. The effect most often observed in cats and monkeys, obtained by stimulation of limbic structures and extrapyramidal pathways, is walking in circles. Usually, the response begins with slow head turning, followed by body turning, getting up, and walking around the cage. In other studies, during stimulation of the fimbria of the fornix, a monkey ran around the cage at a speed of 2.4 meters per second, showing excellent coordination and orientation, avoiding obstacles or other animals in its path. In this experiment, one monkey in the colony learned to press a lever in the cage, which triggered radio stimulation of the test animal. Repetition of these excitations produced conditioning in the stimulated monkey.
Okay. So, let's talk about that 15 minutes. So it says in scientific literature, there's already a substantial amount of information demonstrating the remarkable effects induced by ESP. The heart, for instance, can be stopped for a few beats, slowed down, or accelerated by suitable stimulation of determined cortical and subcortical structures, illustrating the physiological reality that it is the brain which controls the heart and not vice versa. Respiratory rate and amplitude have been driven by ESB. Gastric secretion and motility have also been modified by brain stimulation. The diameter of the pupil can be adjusted at will from maximum constriction to maximum dilation as if it were a photographic camera. Scary. Simply by changing the intensity knob of an electrical stimulator connected with the hypothalamic region of the brain. And that's on pages 29 to 31 of the PDF I sent you. This chapter goes through most of the complaints that TIs have made about electronic harassment. I've heard complaints regarding some TIs have claimed that they have felt symptoms of heart attacks. They have had respiratory issues and also visual issues due to some remote stimuli. And then in another part, it says the surprising fact is that depending on its location, electrical stimulation of the brain is able to evoke not only simple responses, but also complex and well organized behavior, which may be indistinguishable from spontaneous activity. And that's on page 20, and that's on page 32 of the PDF. So it is possible that you could be sitting still and suddenly jump up and do something spontaneous. Sometimes you're caught off guard by this sudden activity, right? Excuse me. Sometimes you're caught off guard by this sudden activity, but you go with the flow because after all, it was you who initiated the action, right? You did that. You just jumped up suddenly, right? Well, a TI said that she was sitting on a chair in a public computer lab when she suddenly turned around and fell off the chair due to her heavy book bag. She laughed it off and wondered why she suddenly turned around so quickly. She remembered that some guy was passing by and he looked at her with a smirk. This was in the beginning of the campaign when she had no clue what was happening, so she blamed it on herself and fatigue. Now that she has an idea of what was happening, she thinks the guy was trying to get her to check him out and use electronic harassment to make her turn. But because the chair was a swivel chair and she wanted to use the computer quickly, so she wasn't seated properly with a heavy book bag on her back, he was able to provide a stimulus that caused her to turn and look at him, but she lost her balance while doing so. There are so many videos of TIs with videos of people, there are so many TIs have made a lot of videos where there are so many videos of TIs with videos of people just sitting around and the TIs claiming that that person was somehow using electronic harassment because they had a phone or some kind of device pointed at the TI. Well, the Pavlov, I think I said Pavlov before, the Pavlov watch mentioned earlier allowed a friend to remotely zap the person wearing the watch. The electronic harassment or device the beasts are using can be used as an app on a common electronic device. One of the main questions, so maybe that person pointing their phone at the TI, it's possible that it could be happening. It's possible. So one of the main questions that TIs have is, are TIs implanted with some kind of electronic receiver? Some TIs claim that they are, and they claim to have proof. You can watch their videos because I don't really know about the implants. I do know that there is smart dust that can be placed on individuals and act as a receiver or transmitter. PLN has a video on smart dust. Smart dust is real, and it is being used by the general public for normal reasons. I've heard the beast or the gang stalker, sometimes I call it the gang stalker beast. I've heard the beast subliminally say that they have sprayed someone with something. If a TI, and the reason why I say that is because when I in the video, if you watch PLN's video on smart dust, what they do is how they use it for in agriculture is a plane, I think, passes by and it sprays the whole crop field with smart dust. And then what they do is they use they use a computer to get information about what's going on with the crops and the plants after the smart dust has been placed on the crops. Which is kind of scary if you think about it, because later on in the video, it says that they don't know how to remove the smart dust. So if they're spraying, this just hit me. So if they're spraying crops with this smart dust to get readings and stuff, how are they cleaning it? I hope they're cleaning it off, and I hope it could come off, because then I guess we're ingesting that stuff, which is weird. But I mean, they're supposed to wash crops, right? Well, wash your vegetables and stuff. Anyway, so, and don't quote me on that. That just hit me when I thought about it. I haven't looked into it or anything like that. So anyway, so the planes spray the crops with smart dust, and then what they do, and the reason why they do that is because it's too hard for them to go through like each plant and get the reading. So when they spray the smart dust, that allows them to get more information than they would if they did it like the traditional way. And then they would get the reading and find out whatever information they needed to get about the crops and all that stuff using the computer, because the smart dust was like relaying information back to them. And it's really tiny too. So yeah, so that's why I mentioned that subliminally the bees have said that they'll spray somebody with something, and I was just like, what are they spraying people with? What does that mean? Anyway, so if TIs are not implanted with microchips, then the bees could have placed material that is similar to smart dust, and I call that electronic harassment particles, or EHP, and that can act as a receiver and transmitter to accommodate an app on the bee's phone, device on their cars, etc. So again, smart dust does exist, and it is being advanced now, and it exists, it's being researched on now, and it's being advanced now. So my theory that I just read you is pretty up to date. And I'm saying that because we're kind of reading about Delgado's research, and Delgado's research was like way back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. But this, what I just told you about smart dust, is up to date. So in the experiment, let's go back. In the experiment of the cats being lifted, and this is my opinion, not something the book read, the cat probably thought it was doing those movements. Okay, in the experiment of the cat's leg being lifted, the cat probably thought it was doing those movements because the mind doesn't have any information of anyone being able to remotely control its limbs, its limb movements. The mind is unaware of this external stimuli and would explain it away, just like the TI explained away suddenly turning around and falling off the chair. She admits that she felt this strange sensation to suddenly turn, and that didn't feel as if it was coming for her. That didn't feel like it was coming from her. But because there was no explanation for it besides something supernatural, she just dismissed the whole event, even though it kept bothering her. And she did. She was like, something's telling me to turn around. And yeah, haven't you said that? Like, something's telling me to look this way or look that way. So she just like, okay, well, whatever. And so now that she has some answer for what now she has some answer for what happened. And as for the cats, I want to point out another way the electronic domino effect stimulus could have been used. If the experimenter wanted to make the cat fall off the table, causing the lift of one leg could have done that. So if the experiment had looked at the cat and said, okay, I'm going to make that cat fall off the table. Okay, so the experimenter doesn't have to go through the whole thing of like shaking the table, going to the cat, pushing the cat, putting devices that will like cause some kind of impact on the cat to move. All the experiment has to do, remember, domino effect, is push that one domino, and pushing that domino nearest was lifting the cat's leg. So if you note, if you have the PDF up, or if you want to go look at the PDF, the picture on page 34 shows the cat appear to be near the edge of the table. So the cat was already at the edge of the table. The experimenter wants to push the cat off the table. It's not complicated. Domino effect. Lift that leg. The cat loses balance. That cat's off the table. So it's a lot easier than it's not as complicated as it seems in most cases. But the cat had a good balance, and that's the only thing that stopped it from falling. And then later on, also note that the cat's mind was being distracted in the experiment by being petted, therefore allowing the stimulus to be more effective. And there's a part also where he's talking about the cat was in mid-jump. And what they did was they contracted the leg while the cat was in mid-jump. And what the cat did was it was able to like readjust itself so it landed perfectly. And this is important, TIs. So what they did was like, okay, we're going to increase the stimulus. So the cat jumped again, and they increased the stimulus on the cat's leg, and the cat wasn't able to adjust, and it landed badly. So just remember that, because it talks about how the intensity of the electrical stimulus could get the effect that they wanted. So when the cat was leaning there, when the cat was at the edge of the table, well, I don't know. Let me not go into that because I don't know. But just keep that in mind. All right. So another reason why the experimenters can cause a domino effect is because the mind is aware that the body can be reflexive. Sometimes you sneeze. You don't wonder why you sneeze. You know your body's going to sneeze sometimes. Well, you probably have something in your nose, so you sneeze. Sometimes you just shift your weight. Like, I've been sitting like this for a while. My leg is probably falling asleep, so my body's going to shift. I'm going to be like, oh my God, they moved me. It's just the body has spontaneous movement sometimes to adjust, sometimes you lose your train of thoughts. You see me do that a lot. Sometimes you yawn, sometimes you stretch or do other things spontaneously. The body just does this to keep itself comfortable, and the mind doesn't question it. It seems as if that is what the mind is interpreting the body's sudden movement as. And the body, however, can pick up that something is wrong, but it senses no danger in permitting the activity that it would normally do. So, like if I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, and my body, and I shift the body. Let's say if there was electronic harassment causing me to shift, my body wouldn't sense any danger in me shifting my weight. I guess it'd be like, well, I guess this leg is asleep. So it's like the body's not interpreting it as a danger, so it'll just go ahead with the motion, even though it may have been suggested otherwise. It may have been a stimulus causing me to do so. The experimenters, and what's happening with the experimenter, like that cat. I mean, the cat's just sitting there being petted and minding its business. Next thing you know, his leg is going up, but he's so busy being petted that he doesn't care. He's like, well, I guess my leg just wants to lift, right? And so then, and what the experiments did in that is that they were hiding the electrical. The experimenters were hiding the electrical stimulus in plain sight. I have observed the bees using the hiding in plain sight technique a lot in the stalking, in the harassment, and in the electronic harassment. The bees are hiding their activities, but they are hiding it in plain sight. Okay? I can't spell it out for you because the bees also watch my videos. I can only give you information so that you can start to figure out things for yourself. So another part says to induce walking in an animal by programmed electrical stimulation of individuals' muscles would be a formidable task, requiring the wiring of perhaps muscles, the use of a complex computer, sophisticated timing mechanisms, large numbers of stimulators with instantaneously adjustable intensities, many sensors, and the help of a team of scientists and technicians, in addition to a cooperative animal and a measure of good luck. The surprising fact is that electrical pulses applied directly to the brain activate cerebral structures which possess the necessary functional complexity to induce walking with apparently normal characteristics. Page 36. Like they can make an animal get up and walk. Okay, so this is good news. That's not good news, but this is good news for everybody because Delgado didn't achieve. Excuse me, because Delgado didn't achieve total control of the body. The way a body works, animal or human, is much too complex and labor intensive for even modern machines to do that, to gain like complete control of your body. So causing a domino effect is easier. However, it seems that the scientists have to sneak the stimulus in. They have to get around the will. And it seems as if the body and mind's compliance is based on both thinking that it came from one or the other. So the body's thinking it's coming from the mind. The mind is thinking it's coming from the body. Okay, you got the green light. The body's like, what the heck is this? You're being stopped. Like, everything's coming out to fight you. The mind senses something and it's like, wait, whoa, that's not for me. The mind's going to start to fight you. But if you sneak it in and one thinks this is the other, or the body thinks, oh, well, I guess my arm felt uncomfortable, so move, it's easier that way. So imagine, so in that way, you could imagine what response the science would get. Excuse me. So in that way, you could imagine what response the scientists would get if the body or the mind was aware that there was a possibility for the whole system to be taken over by an external stimulus. Both the body and the mind would fight like the cat did when the experimenter tried to hold down his leg. So, and that goes back. So in that 15 minutes, what happened was they stimulated the leg to lift while the cat was being petted. The cat had no problem, right? My leg is lifting. I don't care. I'm being petted. The body's like, my leg is lifting. So what? No issue. I'll just balance myself a bit better. I don't know what's going on there, but it's not hurting me. The mind was like, that leg is lifting. Oh, the body must be lifting the leg for some reason. Okay. But then when the experimenter, so what they did was they stimulated the cat's leg again, and the experimenter tried to hold down the cat's leg. The cat fought, mind and body fought that, because so it was like an external person trying to force the cat to hold down its leg. Which was what is more interesting is that they stimulated the leg to lift, and the cat thought that it wanted its leg to lift. It didn't know that it was under external stimulus. So then when the experimenter held it down, the cat started fighting it because the cat just felt like my leg wants to lift, and this guy is stopping me from lifting my leg. I'm gonna fight that person. That's like a twist. That's even more interesting, that the cat fought for the stimulus that didn't even come from the cat, because the cat didn't even know it came from. Anyway, I'm gonna confuse you. So anyway, but yeah. So what is happening is, this is probably why the beasts are still sneaking around and haven't had their big entrance as the invincible mind control entities they wish they were. They haven't got this mind control thing completely figured out yet. And that is good news for everybody, even them. It's not too late to stop this network, and something can be done. All right, so let's go into the last 15 minutes of this.
Another type of complex motor response induced by ESP has been described as sequential behavior, in which different patterns of behavior follow each other in a precise order, as indicated in the following typical example. Monkey Ludi had one contact implanted in the red nucleus, and when it was stimulated for 5 seconds, the following effects appeared. 1. Immediate interruption of spontaneous activity. 2. Change in facial expression. 3. Turning of the head to the right. 4. Standing on 2 feet. 5. Circling to the right. 6. Walking on 2 feet with perfect balance, using both arms to maintain equilibrium during bipedestation. 7. Climbing a pole. 8. Descending to the floor. 9. Uttering a growl. 10. Threatening and often attacking and biting a subordinate monkey. 11. Changing aggressive attitude and approaching the rest of the group in a friendly manner. 12. Resuming peaceful, spontaneous behavior. This complex sequence of events took place during 10 to 14 seconds, always in the same order, but with considerable flexibility in the details of performance. Ludi avoided obstacles in her path, walked with excellent coordination, and used normal strategies in her fights. The sequential response was so reliable that it persisted after 20,000 stimulations repeated once every minute, demonstrating the specificity of evoked effects. Ludi's very different response evoked by radio stimulation of another red nucleus point located 3 millimeters away. Many questions were aroused by these experiments. Why was Ludi walking on 2 feet? Why the chain of behavioral events? Why was she aggressive a few seconds after the end of stimulation? More studies are needed in order to understand these problems, but the fact that similar sequences have been evoked in other monkeys indicates that we are dealing with rather specific mechanisms of intracerebral organization. When reviewing the motor responses that can be induced by electrical stimulation, several important limitations should be considered. 1. Lack of predictability. When a point of the brain is stimulated for the first time, we cannot predict the effects which may be evoked. When the upper part of the motor cortex is stimulated, it is highly probable that the contralateral hind limb will contract, but we cannot foresee the quality of this movement or the participation of other body muscles, or know whether this response will affect the whole leg or only the foot. Once the evoked effect is known, repeated stimulations give predictable results, provided that the experimental situation is constant. 2. Lack of purpose. In some ways, the evoked response is directed by the animal in a purposeful way, but the movements and sequential responses are usually out of context, and there is no reason or purpose for yawning, flexing a hand, or walking around apart from ESP. It is important to differentiate these aimless motor responses from the other types of behavior described later, in which the aim is of primary importance and the motor performance secondary. 3. No robot performance. Brain stimulation activates cerebral mechanisms which are organized for motor performance, but it cannot replace them. With the present state of the art, it is very unlikely that we could electrically direct an animal to carry out predetermined activities, such as opening a gate or performing an instrumental response. We can induce pleasure or punishment and, therefore, the motivation to press a lever, but we cannot control the sequence of movements necessary for this act in the absence of the animal's own desire to do so. As will be discussed later, we can evoke emotional states which may motivate an animal to attack another or to escape, but we cannot electrically synthesize the complex motor performance of these acts. Motor effects in man. The most common effect obtained by electrical stimulation of the human brain is a simple motor response, such as the contraction of an extremity. This effect is often accompanied by lack of voluntary control of the muscles involved, and occasionally it is limited to a local paralysis without any other observable symptoms. In general, the evoked contractions are simple in performance, artificial in character, lacking purpose, and without the elegance of spontaneous motility. For example, in one of our patients, stimulation of the left parietal cortex through implanted electrodes involved a flexion of the right hand, starting with the contraction of the first two fingers and continuing with flexion of the other fingers. The closed fist was then maintained for the rest of the 5-second stimulation. This effect was not unpleasant or disturbing, and it developed without interrupting ongoing behavior or spontaneous conversation. The patient was aware that his hand had moved involuntarily, but he was not afraid, and only under questioning did he comment that his arm felt weak and dizzy. When the patient was warned of the oncoming stimulation and was asked to try to keep his fingers extended, he could not prevent the evoked moment and commented, "I guess, doctor, that your electricity is stronger than my will." If this stimulation was applied while the subject was voluntarily using his hand, for instance, to turn the pages of a magazine, this action was not blocked out, but the induced hand flexion distorted voluntary performance and resulted in crumpling and tearing of pages. In our experience and in reports by other investigators, electrical stimulation of the motor cortex has not induced precise or skillful movements, and in all cases, the evoked responses have been clumsy and abnormal. Excitation of the supplementary motor area, located near the main motor cortex, may induce three types of effects. 1. There can be postural changes, in which the movement starts slowly and attains a determined end point with more or less general involvement of the body. 2. The movements can have a phasic character, such as pawing with the hand, stepping with the foot, or flexing and extending the fingers or wrist. 3. The response can consist of uncoordinated movements. Of special interest is the possibility of activating paralyzed limbs by means of ESB. For example, one patient was suffering from sudden paralysis of the left arm and leg, probably caused by an embolus, and after 4 years, he had begun to experience burning pain in the left side of his body, which was exacerbated by touching his left thorax or arm. After other treatments failed, 2 surgical interventions were performed to ablate parts of the sensor-motor cortex, and it was observed that electrical stimulation in the supplementary motor area produced vocalization, raising of the paralyzed arm, and other motor responses. These effects were similar to those evoked in other patients without paralysis. Thus, it is clear that the supplementary cortex has pathways independent from the classical motor pathways, and that evoked movements may be independent from the integrity of the main motor representation in the cortex. ESB apparently produces similar results whether applied to the motor area of a child or an adult, of a manual laborer or of an accomplished artist. Skills and refined movements do not seem to be represented in the cortex, or at least they have not been aroused by its electrical stimulation. The motor cortex is probably like a large keyboard located on the efferent side, dealing with the output of activity, able to play the strings of muscular contraction and to produce movements, but requiring the direction of other cerebral structures which as yet are little known. In contrast to these effects, ESB may evoke more elaborate responses. For example, in one of our patients, electrical stimulation of the rostral part of the internal capsule produced head turning and slow displacement of the body to either side with a well oriented and apparently normal sequence, as if the patient were looking for something. This stimulation was repeated 6 times on 2 different days with comparable results. The interesting fact was that the patient considered the evoked activity spontaneous and always offered a reasonable explanation for it. When asked, "What are you doing?" the answers were, "I'm looking for my slippers, I heard a noise, I'm restless, and I was looking under the bed." In this case, it was difficult to ascertain whether the stimulation had evoked a movement which the patient tried to justify, or if an hallucination had been elicited, which subsequently induced the patient to move and explore the surroundings.
That was
There are very few clinical reports of complex movements evoked by ESB which are comparable to the sequential responses observed in monkeys. And this may indicate that cerebral organization is less stereotyped in man than in animals. Temporal lobe stimulation in man has induced automatisms, including fumbling with surgical drapes or with the patient's own hands, and well organized movements aimed at getting off the operating table. Usually, these evoked automatisms have not been remembered. Vocalizations and more or less intelligible speech may also be included among complex motor responses, although they represent the activation of motor and ideational mechanisms. Vocalations have been obtained by stimulations of the motor area in the precentral gyrus and also of the supplementary motor area in both hemispheres. The response usually consists of a sustained or interrupted cry with a vowel sound, which occasionally has a consonant component. Chapter 14: Hell and Heaven Within the Brain, the Systems for Punishment and Reward. When man evolved above other powerful animals, the size and complexity of his brain increased, giving him superior intelligence along with more anguish, deeper sorrow, and greater sensitivity than any other living creature. Man also learned to enjoy beauty, to dream and to create, to love and to hate. In the education of children, as well as in the training of animals, punishment and reward constitute the most powerful motivations for learning. In our hedonistic orientation of life to minimize pain and seek pleasure, we often attribute these qualities to the environment without realizing that sensations depend on a chain of events, which culminates in the activation of determined intracerebral mechanisms. Physical damage, the loss of a beloved child, or apocalyptic disaster cannot make us suffer if some of our cerebral structures have been blocked by anesthesia. Pleasure is not in the skin being caressed or in a full stomach, but somewhere inside the cranial vault. At the same time, pain and pleasure have important psychic and cultural components related to individual history. Men, inhibited by some extraordinary tribal or religious training to endure discomfort, have been tortured to death without showing signs of suffering. It is also known that in the absence of physical injury, mental elaboration of information may produce the worst kind of suffering. Social rejection, guilt feelings, and other personal tragedies may produce greater autonomic, somatic, and psychological manifestations than actual physical pain. There is strong reluctance to accept that such personal and refined interpretations of reality as being afraid and being in love are contingent on the membrane depolarization of determined clusters of neurons. But this is one aspect of emotional phenomena which should not be ignored. After frontal lobotomy, Cancer patients have reported that the pain persisted undiminished, but that their subjective suffering was radically reduced, and they did not complain or request as much medication as before surgery. Lobotomized patients reacted to noxious stimuli as much, if not more, than before their operations, jumping at pinpricks and responding quickly to objective tests of excessive heat. But they showed decreased concern. It seems that in the frontal lobes there is a potentiating mechanism for the evaluation of personal suffering, and after lobotomy, the initial sensation of pain is unmodified, while the reactive component to that feeling is greatly diminished. This mechanism is rather specific of the frontal lobes. Bilateral destruction of the temporal lobes fails to modify personal suffering. Important questions to resolve are: do some cerebral structures have the specific role of analyzing determined types of sensations? Is the coding of information at the receptor level essential for the activation of these structures? Not too long ago, many scientists would have dismissed as naive the already demonstrated fact that punishment and reward can be induced at will by manipulating the controls of an electrical instrument connected to the brain. Perception of suffering. In textbooks and scientific papers, terms such as pain receptors, pain fibers, and pain pathways are frequently used. But it should be clarified that peripheral nerves do not carry sensations. Neuronal pathways transmit only patterns of electrical activity with a message that must be deciphered by the central nervous system. And in the absence of brain, there is no pain, even if some reflex motor reactions may still be present. A decapitated frog cannot feel, but will jump away with fairly good motor coordination when pinched in the hind legs. During competitive sports or on the battlefield, emotion and stress may temporarily block the feeling of pain in man, and often injuries are not immediately noticed. The cerebral interpretation of sensory signals is so decisive that the same stimulus may be considered pleasant or unpleasant depending on circumstances. A strong electrical shock on the feet scares a dog and inhibits its secretion of saliva. If, however, the same painful excitation is followed for several days by administration of food, the animal accepts the shock, wagging its tail happily and salivating in anticipation of the food reward.
Okay. So that's the final 15 minutes of today. So let's talk about that. Let's go over that a little bit. So, really notice the way they manipulated Monkey Ludi and how the monkey responded. So, it says Monkey Ludi had one contact implanted in the red nucleus, and when it was stimulated for 5 seconds, the following effects appeared. Immediate interruption of spontaneous activity. Two, change in facial expression. Three, turning of the head to the right. Four, standing on 2 feet. Um, Five, circling to the right. Six, walking on 2 feet with perfect balance, using both hands to maintain equilibrium during bipedestation. Seven, climbing a pole. Eight, descending to the floor. Nine, uttering a growl. 10, threatening and often attacking and biting a subordinate monkey. 11, changing aggressive attitude and approaching the rest of the group in a friendly manner. 12, assuming peaceful, spontaneous behavior. This complex sequence of events took place during 10 to 14 seconds, always in the same order, but with considerable flexibility in the details of performance. Ludi avoided obstacles in her path, walked with excellent coordination, and used normal strategies in her fights. The sequential response was so reliable that it persisted after 20,000 stimulations repeated once every minute, demonstrating the demonstrating the specificity of evoked effects. And that was on page 42. Imagine that happening with a person. The person will look crazy, right? The person would be expressing rapid mood change, the person would be expressing rapid mood swings, pacing back and forth, and other crazy behavior. The experimenters were confused by Ludi's response, but maybe Ludi was starting to be aware of some unwanted external stimuli, or maybe she recognized the stimulus was not from her and was trying in some strange way to make it stop. Maybe All that was just Ludi acting out her frustration over the unwanted electrical stimulus. I think I have watched crazy people act similar to this, and now I wonder if they were crazy or were they controlled. It's so strange knowing about all this because the world appears different now, and things aren't so black and white anymore. In another part of the book, it says no robot performance. So brain stimulation, and it says brain stimulation activates cerebral mechanisms which are organized for motor performance, but it cannot replace them. With the present state of the art, it is very unlikely that we could electrically direct an animal to carry out predetermined activities such as opening a gate or performing an instrumental response. We can induce pleasure or punishment and therefore the motivation to press a lever, but we cannot control the sequence of movements necessary for this act in the absence of the animal's own desire to do so, as will be discussed later. We can evoke emotional states which may motivate an animal to attack another. Page 42. As will be discussed in later, as will be discussed later, we can evoke emotional states which may motivate an animal to attack another. Page 42. All right. So at the time of Delgado's experiment, um, he was not able to produce a robot-like response, which supports what I was saying before that his research hasn't shown a complete takeover of the subject's body. While this is comforting, remember that Delgado's book was written in the early 1970s, and if his research was continued since then, whether publicly or privately, it's hard to know how advanced it is in the year 2020. Another part says, then the patient was warned of the oncoming stimulation and was asked to keep his hands, and was asked to keep his fingers extended. He could not prevent the evoked movement and commented, I guess, doctor, that your electricity is stronger than my will. And that was on page 43. This is what the beast wants you to believe. That they want you to believe that they have somehow taken over your will, your mind, body, and dare I say, your soul. I think the reason he couldn't prevent the movement is because he didn't know how. I don't think Delgado explained the process and what he was doing to him meaning the patient. It could be that if the subject had more information about what was happening, he could have somehow figured out how to stop it. Delgado already said that the stimulus didn't work all the time, even though it had enough consistency to be legitimate. Also, remember that his research was done mostly on mentally ill people who already had a weakened or disturbed mindset. During the video, I started during like the reading when he was reading the 15. He talked about the electronic harassment being used to make the subject shift, and then they would ask the subject, oh, why did you turn your head, why did you shift? And the subject would like make up a reason for it, like, oh, I guess I heard something, or I dropped something, I'm looking for my slippers. And I wanted to like when they said that, I wanted to say, oh yeah, that's what I was trying to point out before when I said that the mind just explains it away. So he thought that too. But I stopped myself from saying it because if I start talking, then you won't hear what the narrator was reading. um so if you heard me start saying something, I had to stop myself because I was like, I can't say it because that's gonna like, you know, the narrator's gonna keep reading. So in another part, it says the interesting fact was that the patient considered the evoked activity spontaneous. Oh, here, it's ironic. The interesting fact was that the patient considered the evoked activity spontaneous and always offered a reasonable explanation for it. When asked, "What are you doing?" The answers were, "I am looking for my slippers. I heard a noise. I'm restless." And I was looking under the bed. In this case, it was difficult to ascertain whether the stimulation had evoked a movement which the patient tried to justify, or if an hallucination had been elicited, which subsequently induced the patient to move and to explore the surroundings. And that's on page 44. This confirms what I said earlier, that the person thinks the movement came from them, and the mind makes up an excuse for it. I read or listened to the book in the 15-minute intervals, and then I wrote my comments in that section. I don't read ahead. So if it seems repetitive, it just shows that my conclusions are correct. And even if my conclusions weren't correct, I would not hide that either because you can learn from your mistakes, right? So that's the first part of the book. Thank you for sticking with me. Yes, it was boring in the beginning. It started off really slow and boring, but I think it's becoming more relevant and more interesting now. Next week's discussion will finish chapter 14 and start the first few paragraphs of chapter 19 for those who want to read or skim next week's chapter before the TI hour. Like I say, it's okay if you don't understand it. You could always ask me questions. I'll give the best answer I could give. And then you could always look into it to and do your own little like Google search, research, or whatever to find an answer for yourself. Um, so I'm going to end this now, but please come back in a few minutes for random talk, or watch it on the replay because I have a videos that can introduce you to more of Delgado's research and show a recent research that is relevant to this topic. So I'm going to close this down. I'm going to close this now, and then I'm going to come back in a few minutes just to do a quick it's not supposed to be long, but I'm gonna do a quick video. I'm gonna show you a few, like 3 videos or something, just to like gel this together. Anyway, I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay. All right. Thank you for watching. Bye.